So this we're going to talk about some really core functionality, and that's the Azure Identity Services. So identity, being able to be who you are in any environment, is really core to how all of the cloud works, and indeed any computing system works now. So you really do need to rely on identity services to make this work for you and to make this work for your customers. So identity management is the process of authenticating and authorizing security principles. So who are you? It involves controlling information about those principles and around those identities. And then the security principles can include services, applications, users, groups, who you are. Microsoft Identity and Access Management Solutions help IT protect access to applications and resources, not just in the cloud, but this can also be extended back into the data center. You can actually sync your internal Active Directory to Azure Active Directory and use that. You can use federated identity, you can use all sorts of other kinds of logins and other things. It's really neat how this works, right? Such protection enables additional levels of validations. You can use multi-factor or conditional access policies. So you can say that, well, I don't want someone logging in between midnight and 5 a.m. because I want people to have a good night's sleep. And you can literally lock things out so that they can't log in between midnight and 5 a.m. regardless of what's going on the network. And you can also monitor suspicious activity through advanced security reporting, auditing, and alerting. So again, people trying to brute force their way into someone's account, accounts being disabled and someone trying to log in, single sign-on, service accounts, all the other things are all managed and monitored. So you can just really just run your audits and find out who's doing what and how they're doing it and work from there. So when you're using Azure Active Directory, you basically have some steps that you go through. You're going to create and manage a single identity. So you'll do this for either a hybrid enterprise, keeping users and groups and devices in sync. You can do this for hardware profiles, security groups, application access. You're just going to create and manage all the things that you need to for that user as least privileged to do their job. Then you're going to provide that SSO access to your applications and pre-integrated software as a service apps depending on what you've done as your subscription. But you can also export this out. You can use your single sign-on anywhere. A lot of services now are just basically using single sign-on, whether that's Azure, Google, Facebook, Apple. It's just basically become an identity service for the world. Then you need to enable your application access and security by enforcing the rules. MFA is big for both on-premise and cloud applications. Multi-factor authentication is becoming and has become the de facto standard, especially for administration and super sensitive accounts. And then finally, provision. Provisions secure remote access to on-premise web applications through the Active Directory application proxy. There's a lot of capabilities. You don't need to know all of these, you just need to be aware of them and you need to be able to discuss some of them. But you do need to be aware of single sign-on, reverse proxies. You do need to be aware of multi-factor authentication. Azure role-based, we'll cover that as a different lecture. Security monitoring, we've covered some of that. Hybrid identity management and Active Directory Connect. Identity protection, privileged identity management, so your system administrators or your database administrators, device registration if you need to or have company provided hardware at this point and you want to just make sure that company provided hardware connects to the network. You can actually register the devices. Consumer identity and access management, Active Directory access reviews, and again, single sign-on again with that whole part and parcel of the process. There's a lot of things you can do here. The key of this is single sign-on. Single sign-on is just this neat process that allows you to log in once and use all the services you need that the company provides. You can do this in multiple different ways, but once you're signed in, you get all the applications you need without being required to sign in again. There are some times you don't want this. There are times where you really do need people to sign in specifically to an application intentionally. Single sign-on makes life easier, but there's a lot of things that sometimes you may need that secondary handshake. And there are many organizations that rely on software as a service. Salesforce, Box, everything. So you're logging into stuff, you're logging into school, you're logging into Udemy, you can actually use any of these as you need to. Historically, you've needed to individually create and update user accounts with each software as a service application, and now you don't. It's all just one big happy thing, and if you add multi-factor authentication to it, it makes it a whole lot more secure. So SSO and Azure Active Directory. Active Directory for Azure extends your on-premise Active Directory environment into the cloud. You can use Active Directory Sync. You can get everything talking to each other really, really nicely over a VPN. And then you have all your software as a service applications and you are ready to go. It's really straightforward to set this up. Not only do users have to not manage multiple sets of usernames and passwords because that's painful, right? You can provision or deprovision application access automatically. So if they move around, you can change things around, move them from different security groups, and understand that you now get security and access governance controls, which you can centrally manage your users' access across software as a service applications. You may want some people to be able to make reports and not others. So you can literally tie these things down by function. It's great when you get things set up, especially if you're in a Dynamics 365 or you're a Salesforce. You can really atomic weight their permissions in that system. Now, you do have an application proxy as part of this. It lets you publish on-premise applications such as SharePoint sites, Outlook web app, IIS, your web-based apps inside your private network, and provides secure access to users outside your network. There may be times that you want to do this, and there may be times that you may not want to do this. Given the era that we live in right now, a lot of that is going to be your employees right now working from home. And so you're going to want to do this application proxy to provide remote access and single sign-on for many types of your on-premise web applications. And there's a lot of software as a service applications that Azure Active Directory will support. Employees can sign in from their home, do their thing, have a great day at work, and then walk away. And you can do all of this through that cloud-based proxy. Multi-factor authentication is super important. You should really do this for all your high criticality accounts, and because it is so cheap to do it now, you should probably do it for every employee that you have in your company. And that is just to make sure that you have something you know, your username and your password, and something you have like a phone or an email or a text, and security codes. And I try to log in, I use my username, I use my password, it sends me a one-time key code or something else for me to authenticate that it's actually me. If you look at how someone like Google does it, they'll actually do a little pop-up on your phone. Did you try to log in from this address? You can do the same thing in Azure. And multi-factor authentication gives you a strong authentication via a range of verification options. Again, phone, text, mobile app notification, verification codes, third-party OAuth tokens. There's a lot of doing things in here. I use things like Protect One on some websites just because that's what I need to do. And it's just a neat way of making sure that I'm really me. Then you also have role-based access control, right? It's an inbuilt system in Azure Resource Manager, and it will give you really, really good, tight control over resources in Azure. The role-based access control allows you to granularly control access at the level users have. So you can limit a user to only manage a certain group of servers. You can only access a certain level of data. You can only attach to certain databases. These can be wealthy and these can be really hard to manage, but if you've got something that's super critical, then Azure includes several built-in roles that you can use to kind of get an idea of how to build out your role-based access control, and then make sure that you're applying all these to the resource types that are important to you. Right? So there's certain roles, those built-in roles are security monitoring, alerts, and machine learning based reports. So all of these identify inconsistent access patterns that can help you protect your business. So those built-in roles do have monitoring and logging and alerting and some machine learning based, so they understand how you get some weird access patterns. So if I'm trying to log in at 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm usually asleep and I try to log in 100,000 times, that can be something that's really going to be alertable. That's going to be something you're going to want to question. So you can use Azure Active Directory Access and use those reports to gain visibility into your organization's directory. And again, with this information, again, you're empowered with a lot of information being in the cloud right now. Better determine where your possible security risks might lie. You may have someone that you fired who keeps on trying to log in because you only disabled their account. You may have someone that's logging in on weird hours during the day and you don't know why. And this gives you an opportunity to go do a little bit of spelunking or sleuthing, try to figure out what's going on, and maybe come up with a way of solving a problem. You also have a number of inbuilt Azure portal reports that will really help you out. This is great for your security team if they just need a quick report. Anomaly reports are fun. Single sign-in events are found to be anomalous. And just make sure that if someone, again, is trying to do 100,000 logins and locking out accounts right and left, that you know about it. And these reports are really super great in keeping people aware of what's going on from that login viewpoint. integrated application reports, how your cloud applications are being used in your organization. Azure Active Directory offers integration with a lot of thousands of cloud applications, and it's all part of SSO. How does the workflow actually really work in your organization? By login, and then how much time are they spending there, and then what are they doing when they're doing it. So that's a neat way of just tracking business logic, business workflow, and it's all in there. It's just available data that you can just pull up and then hand off to your architect and have them work their way through it. Or if you're getting a new system in, what's the workflow? How does the new system work on that workflow? How does the work breakdown structure actually work? Neat things with these integrated application reports. They're really flexible. Then you've got error reports, and again, indicate errors that might occur when you provision accounts to external applications. I may be trying to get into Workday for the first time with a company, and I may be trying to log in because I've got an email that says, hey, go here, log in, make your account, only to find out that my account really wasn't provisioned. Right? So that error report helps you figure out, oh wait, Dan was trying to log into Workday, but Dan doesn't really have an account into Workday. And this error report will help figure out your trouble ticket desk people to figure out what's going on and when you're provisioning accounts to any kind of external applications you may have. User-specific reports, you may want to track me through your network and find out what I'm really up to. You can find my single sign-in activity by specific user. If you need to find out if I'm exceeding my authority or if I'm going places in the organization that I should not be going, like legal and HR, because I'm not a member of the legal team, nor am I a member of HR, you can find out what's going on. Maybe ask me a couple of questions like, Dan, why were you in the legal system at 4 o'clock in the morning? And then finally, your activity logs. All of the audited events, the last 24 hours, the last 7 days, the last 30 days. Now, I would go ahead and pull all that data off, and I would keep it because I may need to by regulation on day 29 and pull all the data over to a database so I can have a data warehouse of this stuff. And it's just essentially to meet whatever legal or regulatory compliance that I need to have. But those activity logs on board that are just available to you, contain that record of all the auditable events. And that's what you would be using, especially if you were trying to figure out if something weird is going on, right? AD-B2C, so Active Directory Business to Consumer is a global identity management for consumer-facing applications. And again, we use this every day. We use this when we're logging into MSN. I use this for a number of colleges that have my Microsoft credentials for that. And you're going to use this so that customers can sign up for their applications by using their existing social accounts, Facebook, Google, Amazon, LinkedIn, or new credentials. So that's all this is. This is the connector that allows you to use whatever credentials you've got already. Don't make another account on another system. Let me just use my Google or my Facebook or my Amazon or my LinkedIn login, and boom, I've got access to all this stuff, and I'm a happy person. So AZ B2C is your consumer facing. How do you get people to use others' credentials so that you can log in? Device registration is a little bit more interesting. I actually really kind of like this one because you may actually have company provided devices, phones or laptops or computer systems or something else that generates data. And you may want to make sure that that data and it has an identity that authenticates the device when the user signs in. So this is really kind of neat. From that vantage point of if I have a company phone, I log in from that company phone. Not only is it my username, my password, and my MFA, but the device itself says, oh, hey, this is the company phone. He's trying to log in from that company phone. He can use that. And that's where you can go with this. So device registration is really kind of neat, especially if you've standardized what devices you've used, or you can pre-configure your device for this. So when combined with mobile device management, there's just a lot of neat things, especially if you have people in the field and they're using tablets, whether that's Surface or iPads. You can then recreate that whole conditional access rules to enforce access from devices to meet your standards for security and compliance. It is a neat thing to do, especially if you need that level of security for authenticating devices, especially devices that the company provides, where users will be actually giving and putting information into the company. So Azure Active Directory also has some really good privileged identity management process. You can manage, control, and monitor your privileged identities, and those are going to be your system administrators, your DBAs, your network engineers, maybe some senior management, and those are all people that might be part of online services and otherwise. But anyone with a privileged identity can be monitored and tracked, and that's important because you don't want to lose a privileged identity account for whatever reason. And then you've got identity protection. So this is just a baked in part and parcel of the process for Azure Active Directory. It's a security service that provides a consolidated view into risk detections and potential vulnerabilities into your organization's identities. So let's say someone quit and you forgot to disable their account and they're just logging in and you know that they quit, then that's something you can go and take advantage of. If you've got data that's been encrypted and you've disabled their account and you need that data to be decrypted, you can go in and reinitialize the account with a new password and make sure that that data is unencrypted. You can do a lot of other things and check for anomaly detection, right? Those Active Directory anomalous activity reports are really super important because it will tell you who's trying to do what with what, especially on service accounts. So identity protection introduces a new risk detection types that can detect these anomalies in real time, and then you can alert your security people, and your security people can go hunt all this stuff down for you. Then there's hybrid identity management. And again, I know there's a lot of data here, but this is just really kind of neat stuff that you really do want to at least be aware of for the test, right? Microsoft's identity solutions span on-premise and cloud-based capabilities. So you're going to have your company Active Directory and you may have an Azure Active Directory, and you can sync those two together. You can sync them so that you have a common identity for users across Microsoft 365 products, Azure, software as service applications, and your internal network. And there's just a lot of neat features that go along with it. A lot of features that go along with this. But the idea of AD Connect, Azure Active Directory Connect, is the Microsoft tool that will allow you to sync your data center to Azure and make all that work. So it gives you synchronization, federated identity through other applications, pass-through authentication if you need it, and then health monitoring for those services. So those are all of the things that AD Connect can give you, and it's a really important part of your hybrid identity management process. And then finally, in summary, I know there are lots of this, and big takeaway, watch this video a couple, 2 or 3 times. Right? As your Active Directory helps manage your cloud and non-cloud permission sets. So it can be set up for single sign-on and federated identity, and can be used in conjunction with third-party federated identity sign-on like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Apple, and everybody else. But it is a neat tool to have. There's some really good anomaly detection in here. And again, lots to this. Big takeaways from this, though, are again, Active Directory, cloud and non-cloud permission sets, SSO, and then setting up for third-party authentication through Google, Facebook, or otherwise. And that's it for this section. I know really super huge, but do watch this video a couple of times. I will see you in the next lecture. We're going to talk about authentication and authorization. There's a difference between the two, and we're going to be able to sum that up really quite quickly. Authentication is the process of proving that you are who you say you are. So sometimes you'll see that called auth-n, especially if you see that in math or you see that in somebody's documentation. Auth-n means authentication. The Microsoft Identity Platform uses OpenID Connect protocol for handling this. And again, we just got done talking about how Active Directory works in there. And this is where you're going to work on that login process. Then you have authorization. That is the act of granting an authenticated party, so someone who's already given their username, their password, maybe some code, some MFA, something else going on. So they've authenticated. Now they're getting authorization, and it specifies what data you're allowed to access and then what you can do with that data. So authentication is the process of logging in. Authorization is the process of actually doing work. And that's the big thing to remember. You'll see it authorization shorted to auth-z for authorization, and the Microsoft Identity Platform uses OAuth 2.0 for handling this, and that's the big part of this whole section. So authentication and authorization, you're using the Microsoft Identity Platform, Active Directory, and you're going to create apps that maintain their own username and password. It incurs a high administrative burden. We're going to try to get you to use SSO or federated identity as much as humanly possible, and then you can have your applications delegate that responsibility to your identity provider, and it will make life a lot easier for everybody. And this is how we code in the modern world. It's very rare, unless there is something very super risky important, to have a separate application that has its own separate authorization and authentication process. So Azure AD, we've talked about this in the last one, is going to be your centralized identity provider, and you can do conditional access policies that require a user to be in a specific location, which is kind of interesting. You can set it up for home office, or you need to be on a VPN to access certain resources, or you need to be in an office, geofenced somewhere in particular to access a certain thing. I know one company I worked at geofenced their entire organization to just the lower 48. You had to be somewhere in the United States to access their stuff. You could not be in Alaska. You could not be in Hawaii. You had to be in the lower 48. You couldn't be in Mexico, Peru, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, India. You could be nowhere but in the lower 48 to access stuff. And that was kind of interesting because, you're working remotely. You maybe want to take a little trip to India. You could not do it working for that company. And then, of course, the use of multi-factor authentication, which is something called two-factor authentication as well. So you'll see multi-factor or 2FA. They all mean the same thing. There's some really interesting protocols. You probably do want to know these, OpenID Connect and OAuth. So OpenID Connect is built on top of OAuth 2.0, and that's important to know, right? OAuth 2.0 is really the thing. You're going to find a lot of companies that specialize in providing this kind of service. And again, Okta, Active Directory, you name it, just about everybody does this because this is where some really interesting services are put together. And you can use your Microsoft Identity Platform as part of this whole process. But just remember OAuth OpenID Connect or OAuth SAML, and that's what you've got for your protocols. Again, there's not a whole lot you really need to know here for this section other than what is authorization and what is authentication. There's some protocols here you do want to know about: OpenID Connect versus SAML. SAML is a little bit more old school, but both OpenID Connect and SAML can authenticate a user and enable single sign-on. Now, SAML is commonly used with Active Directory, federated services, and Active Directory. So if you're going to use it, that's okay. You can use also OpenID Connect. It works well, but it's commonly used for apps that are purely in the cloud, such as mobile websites, web APIs. So your Salesforce.com, your Microsoft Office 365, things like that are all going to be using OpenID Connect to work it through. And then finally, in summary, this is really what you need to know for this section: authentication and authorization. And again, authentication is the process of proving you are who you are, auth-n, and then authorization is the act of granting you things to do, things that you can do with your authentication. And who you are will specify what data you're allowed to access and then what you can do with that data. Authorization is also sometimes called auth-z, and everybody uses OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect for connecting through. Again, really super quick section, and I will see you in the next lecture. 5.3, we're going to be talking a little bit more about Active Directory. You can obviously kind of tell that Active Directory is the underpinning for a lot of the active things that we do in making sure that people can authenticate against your services or your applications. So Active Directory in its own right, we're back to that. Again, Microsoft's cloud-based management service, access, and helps employees sign in, access resources, and it will get you into your portals, Office 365, Azure portal, thousands of other applications, and again, all your internal stuff that you would go through to access. So for more information about creating your tenants and other stuff that's beyond the course parameters, but just so you know that you can create a new tenant in Azure Active Directory and kind of separate all your stuff out that way. So Azure Active Directory, its management and maintenance, is basically intended for IT admins. So as an IT admin, you can use Active Directory to control access to your apps and your app resources based on your business requirements. So you're going to want to work really, really closely with your auditing and your compliance group to make sure that your access and authorization is by policy and by role. Right, that just makes it easier to settle all that out. Everything that you've set up already in your on-premise Active Directory can be pulled over, and you can use multi-factor authentication, so you've got all those things that you would normally expect to have. Additionally, you can automate user provisioning, and that's kind of neat. So there's some automation that you can put in there, especially for Office 365 and some other cloud apps, to make it so that the burden is a little bit less than what you would expect to have from manually provisioning accounts. And then finally, you can protect your users' identities and credentials. You can actually get some premium going. You can actually sign up for a 30-day trial if you want to try it out. But there are ways to meet your access governance requirements, depending on what they are. Active Directory allows you to programmatically do all that and monitor and maintain your user identity and credentials. So again, when you're using Active Directory, it's intended to basically work with all of the software as a service applications that you may have out there in the cloud. So Office 365, Microsoft 365, Dynamics, CRM, all those things are there. as a subscriber, you're already using a lot of Active Directory already for each Microsoft 365 Office. An online tenant is automatically on that Azure directory. So if you have a Microsoft Office 365 subscription from one company and then you consult with another company and they may have a different one, you'll actually be having two different Active Directory tenants. And then you can immediately start to manage access to your integrated cloud apps. There's no delay here. You sign up for Office 365, you start using it, you can start provisioning it right away and authorize all the users that need to be authorized. It's also really good if you're an app developer, because remember, we want to have a standards-based approach for single sign-on into your app, but we also need to have service accounts to make sure your app can talk to databases or to write to files or write to buckets or data, upload pictures, upload videos. So all that stuff's going to happen on a service account. It also provides you the ability to work with APIs that can help build personalized app experiences, whether that's through cognitive services or something else. There's ways of making Azure Active Directory really that linchpin for all of the services and all the permissions that your app may need, either through service account or by user. So must have for some services, you must have Active Directory. For some online business services such as Microsoft 365, Microsoft Azure itself, though portal.azure.com, right, require Azure Active Directory for sign-on and help with identity protection. If you subscribe to any Microsoft online services, business services, you automatically get Azure Active Directory with access to all of the free features. So you're getting this whether you want it or not. It's just a neat way of just managing stuff. You can tie it to your current Active Directory, your current authentication system through OAuth, and go from there. You will need to use it though. So service tiers, there are two tiers on this one. There are paid capabilities. So you actually have Premium P1 and Premium P2 licensing. So Azure paid licenses are built on top of your existing free directory service, right? So you're going to have your basic free, and then you can go Premium 1 or Premium 2 licensing. And that just gives you enhanced monitoring, security reporting, and secure access for mobile users and other things you may want. Again, my favorite example for mobile users is working for a power company, and they had people out in the field with their little Surface tablets, and they were actually able to secure the mobile user by authenticating the user and the device to make sure that whatever was coming in from those remote locations was actually what needed to be done, and that was definitely a P2 license service. So your service tiers, these are what you do want to know for the test. Active Directory free, you get that regardless of whether you want it or not. It comes with a lot of Microsoft 365 services, popular for software as a service application, single sign-on across Azure. And it provides basic reports, some directory synchronization between your company and Active Directory in the cloud, and then some self-service password change. So that's kind of neat. Active Directory P1, Premium 1, in addition to free features, also lets you use hybrid users, access both on-premise and cloud resources. So it supports advanced administration, dynamic groups, self-group service management, identity manager, cloud write-back, which allows self-service password reset for your on-premise users. So a lot of people, if you're going to do this, you're going to be P1. You're definitely going to want to have those services for your company. And then finally P2, which is probably really the one everyone's going to really want, is that you're going to get some good identity protection to help provide risk-based conditional access to your apps. Do some critical company data, privileged identity management to help discover, restrict, and monitor administrators and their access to resources. And again, just-in-time access when needed. So if you're really committing the whole way, you're going to go with P2 and go from there and have all the things. A lot of companies will simply just use P1 because they don't think they need to cover their administrators or have other things they need to do, but it's there for you if you want it. So in summary, just know that there are three service tiers, free, P1, and P2, and what they cover. Get some free online services regardless of need. You're just gonna get it. You're gonna get Active Directory regardless. It is the cornerstone of the Azure identity process for SSO and other federated identity services. So your developers or your customers will probably end up using a lot of this to tie into their Facebook or their Google or their other accounts if they don't just have a native Microsoft account to go with it. So that's how this whole thing works, and that is Active Directory. And I will see you in the next lecture. So even more Active Directory. So you can obviously tell that this is a big deal when it comes to the test, and there's a lot of things that you're going to need to know about it. It is well represented across the entire syllabus for this test. So we're going to talk about some usage and some functionality in Azure Active Directory. as it kind of goes through, and you're looking at it from that architectural viewpoint. And that's really what we're going to look at it from this one is what does it architect as? How does it fail over? How does it write? How does it keep track of people? All that good stuff. So again, we've already talked about what is Active Directory. Just to kind of recap that, enables you to securely manage all your services and users. Full suite of identity management capabilities, including federated, OAuth, Open Connect. So you can do a lot of things with it, and it's including service accounts, some security monitoring and management and maintaining. So you can allow and enable permissions to allow and deny access to enterprise resources. It's the whole kit. It's everything you would want. It's essentially an internal database. It's internally just a database full of people, and you have security groups, and you have role-based access controls, and you have users and usernames and passwords and devices, service accounts. You're going to have some policy that you need to be able to relate to in terms of compliance. So the big thing on this one is you kind of go through and you take a look at how Active Directory is actually architected internal. You need to know that Active Directory is actually baked into Azure itself. It is distributed throughout the entire architecture of Active Directory. It combines extensive monitoring, rerouting, failover. It is hugely disaster recovery and resilient. So for you to know this, you can deliver company-wide availability and performance to customers because that's what Microsoft needs to do. You don't have to worry about that. They'll take care of it. Now, the interesting part about how Active Directory actually works is that there's replicas across the board. Right? So you may have your Active Directory in your company, and you may have a replica of that in Active Directory for Azure. That's then tied to a bunch of other stuff. And then you can put those other directories out there. You can actually replicate that out as secondary to specific offices if you've got specific offices or specific groups who may need different things along the way. So you have a primary replica that receives all the new data. So it's going to have all the new users that are put in, all the new security groups, all the new service accounts, and everything else. It writes all the stuff to that partition it belongs to. Any write information is immediately sent out to the secondary replica in a different data center if you've got that set up before returning success. So you can have geo-redundancy of writes for your Active Directory along the way. A secondary replica, same thing. They're all physically located across different geographies, but they're replicated asynchronously. So that's the thing to remember, is that you have the one in your office, in your data center. If you still have that, you have your primary and Azure, and you can have secondaries spread across the network. And you can do this and sync them all pretty rapidly across the board. And you're only going to be limited by latency between data centers. They're amazingly scalable, right? So the ability of the service to expand to meet increasing performance needs is pretty much greatly done. Again, that's done by partitioning the data, read scalability, because you're going to do a lot more reads than you do writes. More people are going to log in than you're going to be making new accounts. You can request from directory applications that are routed to the data center that they're physically closest to. So you don't need to have your Active Directory in the same data center that you have your application. You just have to know how to route to it, and then make sure that you are sending everything back and forth and know what your latency between data centers is. So directory applications connect to the nearest data centers. Hopefully you've got, if it's critical, your Active Directory is in the same data center as your application, or at least in a near zone or a near region, so that you can actually tie everything together well. Again, you need to think about latency. You may want to geo-route your customers to make it a little bit easier to go to the nearest data center where you have basically space in there. So you're going to want to work on that. And again, it's a lot of architecture behind the scalability. And then fault tolerance, of course. There's a lot of fault tolerance built into Active Directory. There could be failover, which you may lose a write ability, but it's only for 1 or 2 minutes. There's no read availability affected. So people will always be able to log in. You just may not be able to make a new account for a minute or two, and depending on how busy you are, that may or may not be a problem. Read operations, again, which are going to outnumber writes by a lot, only go to secondary replicas. So you can actually work that through the process fairly easily in terms of routing how you want users to log in and whether you want them to log in. And again, the data is very durable. It's committed to at least 2 data centers prior to being acknowledged. And this happens first by committing the right on the primary and then replicating it out. This all happens automatically inside of Active Directory. And then this right action ensures the potential that if there's a potential loss of data in the data center, that the hosting the primary does not result in a data loss. So again, you're replicated across the board. This is all automated. You can set it up so that you can manage bits and pieces of this up for yourself. But again, Active Directory, really, really resilient. So Active Directory maintains a 0 recovery time objective, and that is not to lose data on failovers. And what that means is that your tokens and directory reads are there all the time. So 0 data loss, not going to happen. Allowing only about 5 minutes for recovery operations for directory writes. So you may have to wait 5 minutes to build that new user out. It's in every data center. And that Azure's replicas are stored in data centers located throughout the world. And again, you can check and see Azure's global infrastructure to kind of go through that whole process of if you need to know where they are. But I would know the recovery time is about 5 minutes for directory writes. Data consistency, everything is synced together. If there's an anomaly or something weird going on, then you may not get an update through that, or they may do a tell me 3 times process in terms of what does the data say. If it's one thing in 2 locations, the 3rd location is automatically overwritten with the current data in the 2 other locations. So one typical problem, again, there may be some latency, there may be some other issue across the board. One data center may be down, and syncing back to the data center when it comes back up can be a wait or a time. So Azure AD implements a daily backup of directory data. Right, so you've got that, and then the directory also implements soft deletes instead of hard deletes. So you can delete somebody, but that may be accidental, so they'll kind of just put a flag on it and say, well, okay, maybe they want to be deleted, and then wait 30 days. If you disable an account, that is immediate, and that is the thing to remember. But if you do an accidental deletion, you have a soft delete that gives you 30 days to restore that person back, and you can do that via the API or via the portal. And then you get all the metrics and monitoring that goes along with it. So, you're going to get world-class metrics and monitoring capabilities on your Active Directory. It's going to analyze and report service health metrics, so you can go through service health on that one. And then also, there's a lot of continuous development and tuning. So you've got an army of developers that are back there making sure that everything works. And you get neat stuff, you get neat data. There's a lot of secure operations. Again, we're going to use MFA. Multi-factor authentication for any operation is doable, as well as auditing all operations. Generally, technically, people are going to MFA on login, especially for a privileged account, and then audit everything that happens. All right. In addition, using just-in-time elevation to grant necessary temporary access can happen as well. Sometimes you may need to promote somebody temporarily to do a thing, or give them a 5-minute window to complete a task from the help desk, and that can be done at push of a button by a system administrator. It's a neat thing. So in summary, just make sure that you understand that Active Directory enables you to manage access to your services and your resources, full suite of identity management, and that you understand and can answer what is Active Directory. And then with Azure AD, you can create and manage users and groups that enable permissions to allow and deny access to enterprise resources. And that's really all you really need to know for this test. There's not a whole lot, but there's a lot of stuff that goes on with Active Directory. It's a very in-depth and very detailed tool, and if you go on into your Microsoft career and get more certificates in it, you'll want to know a lot more about this service. And that's it for this section, and I will see you in the next lecture. 25. In this section, we're going to talk about access, and that means access to your systems, either conditional or full-time. It all depends. So conditional access we'll talk about first. And that is one of the things where is a tool used by Azure to bring what's called signals together to make decisions. So it's a tool to make decisions, enforce organizational policies. So conditional access is at the heart of the new identity-driven control plane. So conditional access policies at their simplest are if-then statements. If a user wants to access the resource, then they must complete an action. So a payroll manager wants to get into payroll and is required to perform multi-factor authentication against it. If you're a system administrator and you need to get into the VM wing, then you need to MFA. If you're a DBA, you may need to do other things. So you're going to have that whole process on conditional access is predicated on who you are, what you got, and then what hoops you need to jump through to get access to that particular thing. And again, it's part and parcel of the thing. So you kind of have a use case here, and the test has got a couple use cases in it. And this one may work here. So administrations are faced with two primary goals, right? Empower users to be productive, but protect the organization's assets. So by using conditional access policies, you can apply the right access controls to keep your organization secure. So as a system administrator, I may need to do certain things, but my help desk may need to actually do more than I can, but there's no reason for them to have access to the back end of human resources or payroll and things like that. So again, you're basically going to set up your users' conditions and who am I, what do I do, what's my role, what kind of security groups do I need to be part of, and that it turns into your conditional access policy. So common signals, that's what they are using as their language here. Use is actually what it is. Common signals that conditional access can take into account when making a policy decision include user or group membership. So I may be a part of system administration, but also may be part of security. It can be IP location. I can be targeted to specific users and groups. All right, so give me a little bit more fine-grained access control over some server operations. Organizations can create trusted IP ranges used when making policy decisions. So if you're coming from inside the network, you may have more permissions than you would have coming from outside the network, or you may be relegated off to a specific point if you are outside the network and then have to do more things to get in. You can specify entire countries or region IP block range to block or allow traffic from. And again, remember that company that I worked for, that you had to be in the lower 48. You couldn't be in Alaska, Hawaii, or anywhere else in the world. And they basically did that through an IP range or block to only allow from the United States to lower 48. From a specific device, like we were talking about with a power company, that when they would put their linemen out, they would actually specify the user, then the device to collect data, and then users with devices of specific platforms, especially if you've standardized on, like say you're all using iPhone or you're all using some other phone, you can standardize on a platform and then work on that specific state as a conditional access policy. So common signals that are also in use, in terms of how this works, as what application is being used, whether you're in Microsoft Defender, enables user application access and sessions to be monitored. You get some real-time and calculated risk detection. Users attempting to do things that they shouldn't do. You can have those specific things trigger different conditional awareness policies. So if Dan's just trying to get into Office, that's one thing. But if Dan's trying to get into something else that's maybe a little bit more high-powered, maybe a virtual machine or a high-capacity computing machine, maybe some machine language, some AI, a different set of policies are going to apply there because I may not need access to that. I'm not a data analyst. I wouldn't know what to do with machine language if you paid me. So there you go. The little truth in the market there. So common decisions for access, again, is you either are going to block it or use the most restrictive decision. If you are using the principle of least privilege, you are going to use the most restrictive decision on this and either block or grant access. That least restrictive decision can still require one or more other options like MFA, device to be marked as compliant, and that includes your personal computer. If your personal computer does not have an antivirus on it, that can be blocked off and not allowed to connect to the company network. Right? Require hybrid as your joined device. Require approved client app, so an approved VPN or if you approved something else to connect through. Require app protection policies, and then other commonly applied policies along the way. So all these things can help define how that policy is going to get arranged and what that conditional access is going to look like. Remember our zero trust model. We trust no one, and this just helps enforce that zero trust model along the way as you go through. Other common actions required MFA for your management and administration roles, blocking sign-ins for users attempting to use legacy authentication protocols. So if you've got someone in there trying to use some 0.09 thing for TLS or SSL, you can say, no, not going to happen. You need to upgrade your computer system, and that's a good thing. Requiring trusted locations, and again, that location can be a big thing, especially if you are going to allow remote access. You may want to have a jump box or something else is inside of the Azure system for specific people so that they can actually only do administrative tasks from inside if they're at the command line, or you can only access portal commands or something else from specific areas. Right? Blocking or granting access from specific locations is really a good way of doing things, especially if you've got known administration or other things. Blocking risky sign-in behaviors. Did they forget their password 3 times? Right? That's, well, okay, we'll just kind of shut you down for a little bit and try to figure out what happened. requiring organization managed devices for specific applications. I know to get at some of the data on one system, you had to come through a VPN, and that was the way it worked. So you had to have a VPN to get to certain data. License requirements, those were always going to be a thing. And then anything that uses a feature, P1 license in Active Directory, the right to license your requirements, and you really do kind of want to take a look into that, because your licensing will matter here, especially if you set your Active Directory up to be a certain thing. Multi-factor authentication, we've discussed that a couple of times too, and again, that's login, username, password, and then get a code or provide a fingerprint. The username and password is really kind of a common thing. When you've all seen my email address, and that's a common username. So you've already got half of the equation for trying to figure out what my password is. So it leaves an insecure vector for the attack because I already know half of what I need to know. MFA means you have to come up with something else, and you have to come up with something else that's time-bound or device-bound. Right, so either you have to also have access to my chat, or you have to have access to my phone, or you have to have access to something else. So MFA is really the idea that you want to have, especially if it's for administration, if it's for just even for your regular corporate user. Right, MFA is great. I know I use MFA on things like Credit Karma, and my Amazon's all got MFA, and my PayPal's. So all those things really help increase my security, and it's an effective. It's an extra thing that hackers are going to have a hard time obtaining or duplicating. Doesn't mean they can't do it. This means that they've got to jump through extra hoops. And they may not want to. There's easier targets out there. So Azure MFA works just like anything else. Again, something you know, typically a password, something you have, like your phone, not easily duplicated, even though it can be, right? We all know that SIM cloning and other things happen. It's fairly straightforward to clone a phone. But right, we have a trusted device, and something you are, biometrics like a fingerprint or face scan, also works well. Again, you see the cute videos of the kids putting the phone in front of mama's face for access to the phone. Kind of an interesting thing on biometrics, especially for face scans. And then Azure Active Directory multi-factor authentication is really good. It can also help if you're going to do secure password resets. Users register themselves for multi-factor authentication. They can self-register and self-service password support. So again, lots of neat things that you can do with MFA that you really should be doing, especially with the data being sensitive. And honestly, with how cheap everything is nowadays to do this, you just might as well do it for all your corporate users. It just makes sense to do this, and maybe do something a little bit different, geofence or otherwise, for your more secure data, like a company did with the VPN to access certain data. So there are some available authentication methods for MFA, and that is the Microsoft Authenticator app. You can actually download an app and do that. An OAuth hardware token, and that's in preview. So it's not really set. An OAuth software token, that's what I mostly use. I use it for my Protect One or my other systems. SMS, so I can get it through text, or I can actually have the system call me. I don't do that very often. I usually do either a software token through Protect One or through SMS through text, so that I've got that as a one-time code. But you can do it all that way. Not use the Microsoft Authenticator app. And again, with something being in preview, you wouldn't want to use it anyways. So how to enable MFA, I don't know how much of this you're going to really need to know, because this is, again, an overview test. So all Azure AD tenants can use security defaults to quickly enable MFA, right? So for more granular controls, you're going to have security groups, you're going to have group accounts, you're going to have role-based, you're going to have all the things that are really policy-driven or organizational-driven, and you really need to have these things sorted out before you set any of this stuff up. Policies can allow regular sign-in and events when a user is on the corporate network or a registered device, but a prompt for additional verification factors when on a remote or on a personal device. I've done that for some of my things on my phone. I bypassed MFA because it's my phone, but for most things I do keep MFA up and running just in case. And then finally, SSO. We've talked about SSO, and that means you don't have to sign into every application, so you can tie SSO to MFA. And then you've got a really nice way of making sure that your user, whether it's corporate or a client, actually can go ahead and just do the work that they need to do. They sign in once, they authenticate once, they call it good, and you do want to take time to plan out your SSO deployment. So before you do any of this stuff, you have to have a good idea of what you're building. Otherwise, it looks really kind of hokey and it may not work the way you want it to work. So there's a number of single sign-on options you may need to be aware of. Choosing the SSO method. Again, we talked about these OpenID, OAuth, and SAML. And password-based SSO, linked-based SSO, or SSO can be disabled. Most people just turn it on and they're going to do a password-based SSO because it's just the easiest. Single sign-on is not available when an application is hosted in another tenant. So you may need to do other things to get that single sign-on passed through, and there's a whole series of protocols around that you can use to do multi-tenant SSO, so you only have to log in once. It's a neat system that they've got. And again, password SSO, on-premise applications just use password-based, so your username, your password, you do it once and you are in the system and you are good to go. Really straightforward. Then the next one is if you've disabled SSO and it isn't available for the application, you need to authenticate twice or more, depending on what you use. So this is one of those things where you may want to disable SSO when you're just not ready, or you've got something that is like super secret or super secure that you really do want to have a separate username and password for that. You're testing out the application, so you may just want to do test harnessing and not worry about trying to get through SSO. Or if you've got something that doesn't require users to authenticate, but you want them to, right? So with SSO and it disabled, the user will need to authenticate against a certain service. So again, you may just want to do this for testing, or you may want to do this for evaluation. It depends on where you want to go with it. It's all based on what the corporate needs are and what you're trying to do with turning off SSO. You really want to plan this deployment. You really do. The deployment is one of those things that can be complicated. It can be really tied to users, groups, security groups, geofencing, time of day. There's a lot of factors in here. And you can actually do this once you've got a really good plan. There's lots of other ways of doing it. There's lots of other systems to tie into, and you kind of want to know what your software as a service landscape looks like, and how to navigate between the various web applications without having to sign in. So you do want to go and get a plan for single sign-in on deployment. You want to review that plan. It's on the website. It's really good to take a look at. So there's some dependencies here. SSO depends on where the application is hosted, right? Hosting matters, because the way network traffic is routed across to the application, users don't need to use the internet to access some on-premise applications, especially if they're hosted on a local network. So if you've already got stuff in your data center and you need it to have SSO, that's something you may need to program up, but it's all going to be local, right? For cloud applications, federated protocols are used. So you want to use federated identity, and you may want to use the AD application proxy for some of this stuff, especially for remote access. So I know this is an awful lot for the test, and there's an awful lot to this section, but really the key to this is just know the different kinds of SSO, the OAuth, Auth-N, Auth-Z, OpenID, and then MFA, what happens if MFA is disabled, what happens if SSO is disabled, and password, and so on. So it's really, that's all you really need to know on this one. And I know that there's an awful lot to this. We're in our fourth thing on Active Directory, so obviously this is going to be a thing that they're going to seriously cover on the test. So do know all this stuff, at least to the ability to describe it. And that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in the next lecture. 7. We're going to talk about governance. So governance is absolutely huge when it comes to how we manage and maintain our systems. So governance in Azure is just another aspect of Azure management. And we're going to kind of cover some of the different areas for this, but again, governance is huge. There's a whole line of thinking, there's a whole governance section in your organization if you're big enough. And again, that management refers to the tasks and processes required to maintain your business applications and resources that support them. Again, there's a lot of resources, a lot of tools and other things, but how they're used and how they're governed and how the controls fit in and how users access or how they're monitored, all that stuff comes along in the process here. And there aren't just resources, right? There are other clouds and there are things that are on-premise that also fall underneath this governance umbrella. So when you are doing your first initial rollout in the cloud, you really want to design the complete management environment and really understand what you're building and understand the different tools and how they work together. So there's a whole government life cycle, and it follows in certain parts: migrate, secure, protect, monitor, configure, and govern. And these are all elements of a wheel. It's just easy to think about it like that and understand that management and governance in Azure basically are reiterative. You're going to keep on doing this. So if your first thing you're going to do is you're going to migrate, you're going to move your workload to Azure, or you're going to build a workload in Azure. One way or the other, you're going to have something that's business logic, business oriented inside of Azure, and you'll be running it. Secure has the security management and threat protection as sub items. So you want to make sure that you're securing your workload and that no one who doesn't need to get into it can. And then you have to protect. So you're going to have some backup and disaster recovery. And then you're going to monitor. Right? You want to make sure that all your infrastructure and network monitoring, log analytics, diagnostics, all that monitoring is in place so you can make sure that your app is actually functioning as desired and that people are using it as needed and that you are using the principle of least privilege in that zero trust model. You also need to make sure, and this is a big part of governance, your configuration, right? You're going to configure your update management, your automation, your scripting, you're going to do your policy starts and everything else in any of this. And then finally govern, which is going to be your policy management and cost management as sub items. And this is where you're going to have a lot of fun with your legal department and working out how policy and audit and cost management and everything else all works together. But this lifestyle keeps on going. For every new thing that you move over to Azure, you're going to want to do all these steps for everything that you move over. And again, after a while, a lot of this can be automated. There'll be a lot of similarities between things as you go. And we're going to kind of talk about each of these steps. But you do want to know these steps for the test. So the first one is migrate. We're going to transition our workload, some kind of business logic, from running in our data center to the cloud. And there's a service for that. Azure Migrate will help you assess the migration suitability of on-premise virtual machines to Azure. So just the virtual machines, not the business logic. For some business logic, you may need to go into a repository. You may need to refactor or rewrite your code to make it work within there. You're also going to take a look at some site recovery issues, especially when you're migrating virtual machines from on-premise to Amazon Web Services. You've got some database migration assistance that will help you and other things. You've also got a bunch of other assistants that will help you take a look at what you want to migrate piece by piece. And then you can start building out the whole migration plan from that. And you are going to want to make sure that you are as detailed in your migration plan as humanly possible. Then you're going to secure all this stuff. It's the second step. You're going to want to secure your resources and your data. So the security program involves assessing the threats to the cloud, collecting and analyzing data, and compliance of your applications and resources. The good part is a lot of compliance, especially at the data center level and at the virtualization level on down, really falls onto Azure. You don't have to take those costs in, but you will have to do compliance and all the rest of it for your applications. Right, so anything you write, you have to make sure it's compliant with whatever regulation, law, industry standard that you need to subscribe to. So that's security monitoring and threat analysis through Security Center, unified security management, threat detection, hybrid cloud workloads. And again, go into the Security Center. We've covered that in other sections to kind of give yourself a refresh on that. But it's really kind of important that you do start meeting some of your compliance here. And this is where you start doing your due diligence to make sure you've got compliance in place. Then finally, protect, again, keeping all your stuff up to date, and then making sure that even if there's outages that you've still got, your business is still functioning, so you've got some kind of disaster recovery, business continuity going. You've got backups, you've got recovery of data, whether that's in cloud or on-premise. You're using the site recovery tool, and again, you've got all the things that you would need, that if something fails, you're still up and running. You're very elastic and you're very resilient to failure or outages or things happening in the cloud or out of the cloud. And finally, monitor. We're always going to be monitoring what we do. We're going to be analyzing data. We want to make sure that our programs are performing the way they need to, that they're healthy, and that they're available for our users. So you're going to have an effective monitoring strategy. You're going to probably make some custom rules. You're going to do some custom dashboards. So you're going to have a lot of information that's coming at you. And there's going to be, that information can be good for different people, right? You'll have security data, you'll have cost data, network and bandwidth usage data, you'll have systems data, you'll have service health data. So there's a lot of things coming at you from this, so you're going to want to dashboard it. And understanding and coming up with a really good plan to build all those dashboards and understand how to read those dashboards is a big part of the monitoring process. And finally, configure. You're going to be referring to the initial deployment and configuration of resources. And this is pretty much the ongoing. You're going to be doing patches. You're going to be changing things around. You'll be making new user accounts. You'll be making new service accounts. You'll be changing code. You'll be doing other things along the way. So Azure Automation will provide a lot of these services for you and automating configuration tasks. It's also really good for noting if someone changed something and they shouldn't have, right? So you can actually do what's called a run book to handle process automation, configuration, and update management to help manage all your configurations along the way. So that's really kind of important. That configuration, again, is a tool as your automation will give you that bulk. And then finally, govern. This is the big part of compliance and governance. It's the mechanism and process to maintain control over your applications and resources. So this is really where your rubber meets the road. These are going to be your audits. These are going to be your SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 audits, your high trust audits, your Sarbanes-Oxley, your PCI DSS, your GDPR. All those are part of governance. And the things that those governance instruments require you do, you can either check mark or make sure that you've got. Azure Policy allows you to create, assign, and manage policy definitions to enforce rules, which is great because once you've done it, you've done it. You've made all this policy setup and push a button, make sure everything is in compliance. You're doing your due diligence, which is really good from the legal viewpoint, and everybody's happy, including your governance group, the people that need to make sure of what you've got. The even better part is that it helps you do cost management, allows you to track your cloud usage, make sure that you've got the right resources doing the right thing, not just with Azure, but with other cloud providers if you've linked everything through. So the governance section is probably the more important of all these in terms of showing due diligence and making sure that you are in legal compliance. So in summary, really just know that governance lifecycle, right? The migrate, secure, protect, monitor, configure, and govern. Make sure that you understand what they mean and how they work. And that migrate refers to moving workloads to Azure. Secure has security management and threat protection as sub-items. Protect, backup and disaster recovery. Monitor for application infrastructure and network. Log and analytics and diagnostics. Configure, configuration, update management, automation, and scripting. And then finally govern, policy management, cost management as sub-items, and making sure that you are in compliance with any industry rule, law, regulation, or whatever. And that's it for this section. It's a good section to know, and really just know this governance lifecycle for the test. I will see you in the next lecture. Section 5.7, we're going to do a little bit of role-based access control. So role-based access control is just really kind of a neat thing that you can do. It's been around for a long time. It's nothing new under the sun for security. But essentially, it basically breaks down access to specific roles. So if you're a security engineer, you have specific roles across the organization, and that role has specific things that it can do. If you're the CEO, you have a role and you can do anything. If you are the executive assistant to the chief information security officer, you have a certain role, and that role can do certain other things. If you're in the legal department, that has a certain role, and the legal department can get into whatever legal department can. Your legal department shouldn't be a system administrator. Your security engineer shouldn't be able to get to all the confidential legal documents. And that's how role-based access control works. You can build a really beautiful and functional system of permissions based on the user's role. Rather than the individual user, that role-based actually really makes it easy to kind of manage permissions by user role across an institution or across an organization. And Azure Active Directory and the Resource Manager will allow you to do that. So the good part about having something like role-based is that it allows one user to manage virtual machines in a subscription and a user to manage virtual networks. You don't have to give the keys to the kingdom to one person unless their role defines that. So you would have a senior network engineer somewhere that would have permissions to manage all of the company's networks. And you would probably have a network engineer in Chicago that was only allowed to manage the networks in Chicago. So you kind of have that ability to break things up into a little bit more manageable chunks. You may have a database group that allows them to manage all of the SQL databases in a subscription or just certain ones, depending on where they're at. You can allow a user to manage all the resources in a resource group. So maybe you have a senior manager or a senior engineer that needs to manage everything for the Chicago office. That's all the virtual machines, websites, subnets, everything. And that may be something you want to do. You may have a help desk that needs to be able to manage resources within a resource group, such as virtual machines, websites, and subnets, because your help desk has got to have some pretty powerful permissions. You can do this for applications as well. If you have an application that needs to write to a database or needs to read or write to a specific file folder or a specific place in a shared storage, then you can actually break your application down into having service-based roles. And that's super important and super powerful. Your programs only need to have the permissions that they need to have to do their function. You don't have to give a program executive super user power across the board. If they just need to write to a database, that's all the permission they need. So role-based really works under service accounts really, really nicely. And again, this way you can control access to resources using role-based and assign Azure roles. And again, this is a real simple principle. It's been around a long time. And we basically have three things that go into that: the principle, the person, the role definition, and then the scope of that role. So the security principle, again, is the person when we're making that role assignment, and whether it's a security engineer, a network engineer, IT help desk, legal department, human resources department, we all have the job that we have. And we can assign a role to any of these principles, either security or positional. That role definition is just basically the collection of permissions. The human resources department can access payroll where no one else can, and things like that. So usually we just call that a role, and we call it good, and we don't worry about it. And then the scope of the set of resources that the access applies to. So human resources can get into any of the personnel files and into payroll, where legal department can only get into legal department stuff, and then the IT engineers can only work either on networks or on virtual machines or on databases and so on. It's just the scope. And it's just the things that they can do. And that's the only things that they can do when you kind of go through that role assignment. So the thing you do want to remember is security principle is the person, the role definition is the collection of permissions, and then the scope is the set of resources that that role applies to. Now, role assignments are pretty straightforward. You can actually use your org chart for this, and it's kind of nice. So again, and this is a great discussion to have within a company about who has what permissions to do what. It's a great conversation to have, and it's really kind of interesting because a lot of people will say, well, go ask Dan what he does as a network engineer, and that will tell you what he needs for his role. And it may just boil down to that, asking people what they do to define that set of actions that they can perform and that scope without even having to worry much about anything else. And then you can assign these roles either through the portal, the command line, PowerShell, SDKs, or just through ABIs. So you can do a lot of self-assignment on this one as well, especially if you have customers. You can allow them through the REST API to just go ahead and sign up, and they would have a default role as a customer to be able to use your database or use your website to search for products or whatever they needed to do. All right, so groups are a way of just rolling up individual people. So you would have a Dan as your network engineer, and then you would have a network engineering group, and then you would have that network engineering group would fall underneath IT. So IT would have a set of permissions, the network engineers would have a set of permissions, and then Dan would inherit all those permissions based on how that worked. And groups are just a way of aligning everything nicely together, so you can kind of nest groups together and kind of say these role assignments, transitive. In others, for groups, that means if a user is a member of a group and a group of another group, then the user will have both sets of permissions. So you really do kind of want to go back and at least review these on a regular basis and make sure they haven't crept. And some groups have more permissions than they need to have. You can have multiple role assignments, and this is something you see a lot, especially if you get promoted within. If you start off as an IT help desk and then you get promoted to, say, security engineer, and then you move up to security engineer 1, and then you move into CISO. Generally, organizations don't pull all your IT help desk permissions if you made it all the way to CISO. You'll just inherit all those permissions along the way. And that's just kind of another thing you want to do is edit or review or audit people's roles and their assignments as you kind of go through. They may actually take a promotion and not need to be a member of. So someone may be in IT security and then move over to governance, and they will no longer need those permissions for IT security. They'll just need the governance permissions. So if you have a contributor role, that's going to take precedence over all your other roles. So just remember that as you go, that if you can read right, that role takes all that sort of precedence over everything else. The other thing that's interesting too is deny. Denies are really brutal because if you have a permission to do a thing, that deny role will take precedence. So deny assignments take precedence over anything else you do. So I may have permission as Security Engineer 1 to take a look at all the data coming off the Security Information Management dashboard, right? But if there's a deny in there because I got promoted out of the legal department into the security department, I'll never get to that dashboard. That deny will always take precedence over that other role. So you would need to take me out of the legal group because they have a deny, and then I would be fine. So when you're troubleshooting people and you have role-based access control going, make sure that there's no denies in there. So that would be the one thing you'd want to remember for the test is deny rules all. You can set any kind of role assignment as contributor, which is read-write, or read-only. But if there's a deny in there, that will take precedence over any other role assignment that you have. So there are some steps that go through when you're evaluating a person, whether they actually have permission to do a thing or not. So a user, person, a service principal will acquire a token. And notice that means I will log in, use my username, my password, and maybe my FMA, my multi-factor authentication. And then a little file gets written on my computer, and then that's my token. Right? And again, for the rest of the time, we're just passing that token along as part of SSO to make sure I have permission to actually access that resource. So every time I access a thing, there's a call to that token on my computer. And then the resource manager will go and check and say, oh, does Dan really have access to Office 365? Yes, he does. Does he have access to Word? And well, yes, he does. Does he have access to databases? Well, no, he doesn't. And then I will get either allow or deny, and it will go through my day. I won't even notice it. But if I have a deny assignment, that access is blocked, and I may go, oh, wow, why can't I get to that database? I need to be able to get to that database, and then I'll go do a trouble ticket, either through ServiceNow or some other ticket servicing process, and then we can go from there to kind of work it out. But again, that's how it happens in the background. It's just kind of neat that token, every once in a while you may get a invalid login or fails to log in or some other problem. I think we've all seen that. And they'll go, oh, delete your cookies for that organization. And this is really what you're doing, is you're getting a fresh token. You're forcing a fresh token. And it's just kind of a neat thing to know. If you ever have problems logging in, just delete the cookie and it will force you to log back in and you'll be good to go. Now there's some convoluted math in here for the Azure Resource Manager, and I have not seen this at all before, but Azure Resource Manager, again, determines if the action in the API call is included in the roles. And they give you some weird math here, actions minus not actions, or data actions minus not data actions. And essentially what they'll do is they'll take a look at things that you are explicitly allowed to do, and then those are your permissions. And the data you can access, then those are your permissions. Even if you don't have an explicit deny, if you don't have positive permission to use a thing, you can't use it. So that's essentially what that whole math kind of says in there. So when you go through the notes and you're looking at it, just remember, you have to be positively allowed to do a thing. Otherwise, you really can't. If you have a deny in there, then you are explicitly not allowed to do a thing. And sometimes that's a good thing. Right? If there's no role, then your access is not allowed. So again, if there's no positive condition met, access isn't allowed. And so you have to be affirmatively given permission in scope to do a thing. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. And you'll get errors, and then that will return to you going to the trouble desk saying, hey, I need to go here and check this thing, and I can't. And it's probably because there's either no role, or you have an explicit deny, or it's just out of scope for the job that you took. Maybe you just got promoted. Right. So in summary, access management is really cool. I actually really like role-based access control just because it makes it a lot easier to manage who gets what kind of access and standardizes it across the organization. You have explicit denies that will not allow you to do a thing. And if there is no role or there is no affirmative deny or affirmative allow, you still can't do a thing. So that's the neat thing about this, right? You have to be given explicit permission to do a thing to actually access the data. And that's the big thing to remember on this one. So service is free with your Azure subscription, but it's a really neat way of kind of providing some really good fine-grained access control management to all of your Azure resources. And that's it for this section. I hope that wasn't too boring, and I will see you in the next lecture. We're going to be talking about resource locks. So resource locks are kind of an interesting thing in that you can lock a subscription, a resource group, or a resource to prevent other users in your organization from accidentally deleting or modifying critical resources. So resource locks are really super handy to keep people from being people. Resource locks overrides any other permissions that the user might have. So you may have a database administrator who just got fired and we haven't been able to get their resources locked off yet, and they decide to type in drop all tables. Your database system should be wiped out unless you have a resource lock. And that resource lock can say no one can ever drop a table. And that's a really handy way of making sure that you can't delete, you can't drop a table, you can only make something read-only. I am a big fan of cannot delete. I really am. It just solves a lot of problems. If you make it so that someone cannot delete a thing, you can just make sure it really works. But you have only two types of locks: delete and read only. And those are can be really a huge lifesaver. So these are a little bit different than role-based access control, because this actually takes a look at the object itself, or the actual resource, right? So if you have something super critical like your email server, and you can put a cannot delete on it, and that means no one can delete or drop or kill that email server. Users can still read and modify, but they just can't kill it. They can't delete it or ruin it. Read only means that you can only read the resources, but you can't delete or update the resource. So this is kind of restricting authorized users to the permissions granted to the reader role only. And then, unlike the role-based access control, you can use these management locks in general to apply a restriction to all users across all roles. And again, it just makes it a lot easier, especially if you're worried about someone accidentally doing something crazy, like accidentally dropping a table, accidentally killing a database, accidentally killing some part of critical infrastructure for your company. This cannot delete can really save your collective works all the way across the board. The good part, though, is that you can actually inherit that lock. So if you have your master email server with a lock of do not delete, every other email server that spins up as part of that cluster inherits that same lock. So even resources you add later on, so let's say you need to expand, then that lock gets inherited as well. The most restrictive lock in the inheritance is the one that takes precedence. So if you have your master email server that does not have a lock on it, and you put one in the cluster that does have a lock, all of your email servers will inherit that lock. So the most restrictive one wins, always, when it comes to permissions and inheritance. So the scope of lock is kind of important to understand. It doesn't apply to all types of operations. So control plane and data plane. So control plane operations, and you go check it out on management, and then data plane, you may want to go and check out and see what operations are going on your actual inheritance, and you'll see that my account is part of that. So the distinction in the locks prevents changes to a resource, but they don't respect how resources perform their functions. So a read-only lock on an SQL database prevents you from deleting or modifying the server, but it doesn't prevent you from creating, updating, or deleting data in the database itself. Right, so that's a big thing. So just remember, it's all just on that plane for operations, but you can have one on the data plane that says, no, don't allow that drop database. You can actually make it specific to the command. So data transactions are permitted because those are part of the process. So lock management, applying locks can lead to unexpected results, right? Because some operations don't seem to modify the way that you would expect it to. So always go back and check and make sure that anything that is working on a post request through the manager API will actually work or not work, depending on what you want. So locks will prevent post operations. That's the big one. Not that I've seen that one on the test either. So the read-only lock is also kind of interesting. It prevents users from listing account keys. So that's good. Especially if you're using your key vault or otherwise, you do want to keep your storage key list clean and make sure that no one can get into that. So usually a read-only lock is going to be configured on your key vaults, on a lot of your Active Directory credentials, especially for people that don't have account keys. So make sure that you've got that. Your developers and your security engineers and your network engineers will need specific keys. And you don't want them to just be able to list all the keys in the thing because they may pick the wrong one. So a read-only lock prevents the assignment of roles that are scoped to the storage account or data container. And you need to make sure that when you get into your key vaults and other things, that you have a very careful way of looking at how you want to do resource locks. But I would recommend a read-only lock on all of your key vaults and key systems, and then have someone that manages and separately maintains all those credentials along the way. So the big thing to remember, right, is that a read-only lock on a storage account doesn't prevent the data from being deleted or modified, and that's a big one. That type of lock only protects the storage account itself from being deleted or modified. In other words, I can't go and remove access to everyone, but I can delete all the keys. So you do be aware of that, right? They need to know. A read-only lock on an app service resource prevents Visual Studio Explorer from displaying the files for the resource, because that interaction requires write access. And again, there's going to be a lot of little tweaks on this one that you may need to go check out. A read-only lock on a resource group that contains an app service plan prevents you from scaling up or out of that plan. So You may need to turn that off. If you can move from Office Standard to Office Premium, you may need to check and remove any kind of read-only locks that you have on that, if you have any. And then a read-only lock on a resource group that contains a virtual machine prevents users from starting or restarting that virtual machine. So those operations that require a post, you may need to check on that one too. So again, read-only locks can be kind of ugly. You just want to make sure that you're only really using them where you need to use them. They're neat and they're good to have, but they can really break a lot of things along the way. Definitely want to test these out before you do it. So let me see. A read-only lock will keep Azure Advisor from working correctly. Advisor is unable to store the results of its queries. A read-only lock on Application Gateway prevents you from getting backend health. Again, lots of post operations, right? And then a read-only lock on your Azure Container Store prevents all users from accessing any cluster resources. So there's downsides to your read-only lock that you may not want to use on this one, right? So you can't delete a lock. Once a lock is on a storage account, it doesn't prevent the data within that account from being deleted or modified. So this type of lock only protects the storage account itself. And that's the big one, right? You can still go ahead and modify the data, but you should be using versioning and versioning control and other things. So again, it's kind of one of those things you are going to want to take the good and the bad and really sit down and think about how you want to use these. So cannot delete lock on a resource prevents Azure Resource Manager from automatically deleting deployments in the history, right? So if you reach 800 deployments in your history file, any subsequent deployments will fail. There's your hard limit of history of 800. You cannot delete lock on a resource group created by Azure Backup, causes backups to fail. All right, service supports a maximum of 18 restore points. So when locked, you can't clean anything up to make more restore points. You cannot delete lock on a resource group presents Azure machine learning from auto-scaling. All right, so you can't bring in more stuff and you can't remove unused clusters. So you can honestly override. So locks may not be the best thing in the world. To create or delete management locks, you must have authorization to do so. Of the built-in roles, only owner and user access administrator can have these roles, only those two. So managed applications and locks. Some Azure services, such as Databricks, use managed applications to implement that service and requires 2 or more resource groups. If one resource group contains an overview of the service and isn't locked, and the other resource group contains the infrastructure and is locked, things are going to start breaking. So if you try to delete the infrastructure resource group, you will get an error. If you try to delete the lock for the infrastructure group, you will get an error. All right, because you're not owned by that, you don't have the permissions to do it or something else. So if you need to get around this or you don't have permissions, they say there's a way. Instead, delete the service, which also deletes the infrastructure, it's a resource group. So you, again, may want to check into that and make sure all this stuff is actually viable. The cool part is that you can actually bring this up into your ARM template or file to deploy a lock if you need to be aware of the scope of the lock and scope of the deployment. So apply the lock at the deployment scope, such as locking a resource group. Don't set the scope property. So when locking a resource within the deployment scope, set the scope property. So there's reasons when you want to apply and set scope as well, because you don't want to accidentally lock everything and then have to undo stuff. Generally embarrassing. So as an administrator, you can lock a subscription, a resource group, or resource to prevent other users in your organization from accidentally or deleting and modifying critical resources, and only at the systems level, not at the data level. Right? You can set the lock level to cannot delete or read only, but things will break. And you need to be really aware of that there are some historical markers and some backup issues and other things if you set read only. I do like cannot delete, especially if I'm trying to maintain a key vault or something else. I know the data is still vulnerable, but no one can come along and just drop the entire key set. No one can come along and just drop my entire database system, and that's important as well. So I would use a cannot delete in certain circumstances, especially for really super critical. But otherwise, it's kind of a two-edged sword on this one. So you really do kind of want to go through and really take a look at your resource locks when you can, when you shouldn't use them, and how to set scope properly on those. Because you can really honestly break your subscription really super fast by not using locks correctly. And that's it for this lecture. I will see you in the next lecture. 5.9, we're going to talk about tags. So tags are actually really something that are super neat, and they allow you to organize your cloud-based environments a lot better. Yeah, it's an important organizational step in managing and maintaining resources. So tags are essentially the keywords you're going to use to assign or describe whatever that thing goes to. So if you have a database, you would have a tag for database. If that database is owned by human resources, you would tag it with human resources. You can even put owned by DBA or owned by somebody. Again, it's a great way of organizing all of your resources and really great for billing, right? So when to use tags? All the time. I actually really like tags a lot because it allows me to quickly locate resources associated with workloads, environments, or ownership groups. If all of a sudden something showed up that's not tagged, I will have a hard time trying to figure out who owns it. But if it's tagged and it may be critical, I won't accidentally try to kill it off because I don't know who owns it or what it does. It's great for cost management and optimization. Really, it makes them, business groups, really aware of what they're spending in the cloud. So if you have someone in the security department that's constantly spinning up virtual machines, burning them for 10 hours, and then turning them off, you're going to build up those resources 50 hours every week, 200 hours or more, so on and so forth throughout the month. That's going to add up. So what is going on with that? And then you can actually go back and track all this stuff down. Why does someone in the security department need 10 hours worth of virtual machine for 10 hours a day, 5 days out of the week? That's a good question to ask, and tagging will help you find out those kind of resources and those kind of uses. So for me, when to use tags is every day. So for operations management, for visibility into the operations management team about business commitments, for service level agreements, it's really important for operations to be managed well, and tagging for mission and criticality is important. So if you have a primary database, if you have a primary system that manages all your business logic, if you have a Kubernetes deployment that manages all of your data transformation between website and database, those would be critical, and you can tag them as critical. You can actually make it part of your business recovery plan by using tags to actually tier everything out: tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 business processes, right? So all your tier 1 stuff that needs to come up first, and you can use tags to help you implement how that will go. And so if you are in a data center and you need to move over to a different data center because something failed and you didn't do hot spare, these tags can help you re-implement across the board. Security classification is also super important. Your tier 1 application may not be super secure. It may need to be super secure. So you can put internal security classification on everything as well, and make sure that when breaches or other security issues arise, that they're tagged appropriately so you know which ones to go to. So if someone broke into your primary database, it was secure and tier 1, then you are going to want to spend more resources trying to figure out what they got to. And then governance and regulatory compliance, this just makes it a lot easier to govern your stuff and make sure that you're in regulatory compliance. So maintaining consistency is the key to this one. It helps identify changes from agreed upon policy, especially if you have a resource group. And then you can get some good guidance going on. Resource tagging demonstrates how patterns can help deploy governance practices. So it's a lot of fun to actually use this. So when to use tags? Again, for me, every time, every day. Automation will work. A proper organizational scheme allows you to take advantage of automation when you're using resource tags as part of DevOps processes. It also makes it easier for IT to manage. If you've tagged stuff that's in your development environment appropriately, or in your test environment, or in your production environment, or your QA environments, that really helps out. It really helps people manage things, and you don't accidentally move something that's in test over to production without jumping through all the hoops that needs to jump through. Also, some workload optimization. Tagging can help identify patterns and resolve broader issues. Say we rolled out some new piece of logic in a parsing system and I broke it because that's something I would do. Tagging will allow me to figure out what all the dependencies are in that and what did I break, and maybe roll back all the changes that I just made. It's really good for your decision-making process. Your tagging approach can be simple or complex. I prefer simple, but I can also see it where it can get complex, but it can really help manage cloud workloads. So you can say, well, this little part of my Kubernetes container system belongs to my web service, and this one belongs to my data service. So you can actually tag them out by what part of the business logic they're at. So you can actually say step 1, business logic, web server to database parser. And those tags will really help you figure out when you're going along what does what. You have to think about tags sort of like notes that you're making when you're writing code, right? So IT-aligned tagging focuses on such things as workload, application, environment, and you can actually bring those tags into your monitoring environment and get some health along those things. You can actually diagram out visually that entire workflow and using tags identify each step in the workflow and give a little green, yellow, red dashboard lights, or however you need to do it to make it work. So these tagging schemes can help really align your business. All right, it's a lot like accounting, business ownership, business criticality. You can identify all these things and do some really nice visualizations along the board by doing tagging right. It's a great, powerful system. Now, every company does things differently. I get that. So baseline naming conventions, you probably have one kind of naming convention already, but standardizing the naming convention in the cloud is also really super important. So you don't want to just all of a sudden start coming up with a bunch of different kinds of naming conventions. So for me, I know when I'm doing things and I'm writing learning objectives, I will vary between the student and the learner. And for me, it's the same thing, but for other people that are reading my learning objectives, they go, well, which one is it? So I need to find and do a standardized naming convention for all my learning objectives. And it's the same thing for your systems. It belongs to IT, it belongs to security, it belongs to operations, it belongs to Joe's operations, or it belongs to Susan's operations. Which department does it belong to? Right? So you might have existing IT naming conventions in other parts of your organization. This just gives you a chance to standardize. So you need to be aware, though, that rules and restrictions apply per as your resource for your naming convention, and that you need to apply those rules. So find the most restrictive set of restrictions that you've got, and then use that as your baseline for your naming convention. Resource tagging is also really handy, again, for the more sophisticated organization. Consistent naming can provide a lot of support for understanding how does things work within your organization. Tags are also metadata elements. So there'll be name or type and then a value string. So you can say name belongs to Joe. You can say name belongs to Susan. You can say name belongs to IT organization A, or whatever. However, the application of a consistent set of tags and a comprehensive naming and tagging policy is really part of this. This is something that would be great for your work group to do. You really do need to do it. You're going to get some really interesting questions on this and some of the things that you want to do as you go through the organization to figure out how you want to tag things and why you want to do. There's actually a support questionnaire that you can use, and it's kind of neat if you go and you grab that and use it and bring it back to your company. Do your naming and tagging policies need to integrate with existing policies within your company? It just might. Right? You may need to have something that says regulated by HIPAA or regulated by HITRUST or regulated by PCI DSS. Right? Will you implement a chargeback or show accounting? Oh, that's interesting. Well, if my business unit is using this web server and they're responsible for it, they should pay for it, right? So your business unit, you can actually break things down by business unit for payment for their IT resources. So that takes the burden off of IT resources to pay for more things if you don't lose budget. Or you may pool budgets better by using tagging. If you estimated that your business unit is only going to use 10% of resources and you end up finding out they're using 50, well, you need to change their accounting. You need to go back and say, well, you're using 5 times more than what we estimated you would use, so we need you to pay 5 times more money. And of course, that will start a big budget battle and everything else, but you'll have the data. You'll have the data on your side. That will show exactly how much does what. You may have a legal department that pays for 20% of operational burn, but they only really use 3. Well, you can give your legal department kind of a break and give them back some of their budget and say, well, you're not using what you guys said you would use, so here's some money back. Of course, that will never happen in the real world, but it's a nice thing to think about, that you would actually give money back to people that underuse their resources and charge more money for people that overuse the resources. So tags will really help you plan all that kind of stuff along the way. And it really does make life a lot easier in terms of working on sample support. But these are fun conversations to have in the office, especially if you're working on a project. You can actually go through and start doing what the tagging should look like for that project and kind of work out who uses what and when. So in summary, though, tagging is critical, right? It really is. It is a great tool for finding and supporting resources in Azure. It's easy, it's free. You just need to figure out how you want to do it and then be consistent across the board with it. And it can really really help figuring out who's costing more money, resource management, who's responsible for what, where they fall in the workflow, where they fall in the compliance process, and a lot of other things that go into this. The tagging, again, is just one of those things. It's a great system to have, and it is on the test. So you really should know about tagging in a lot of ways. And just what you need to do is, that it's great for finding and supporting resources. It's easy, it's free, and can really help with cost optimization and resource management. And that's it for this lecture. I will see you in the next lecture. Point 10, we're going to be talking about policy. Now, everyone's favorite thing is policy, right? So a big part of security really does rely on policy, and a big part of just helping maintain and organize your organization is built around policy. Policy is basically standards and allows you to do compliance at scale, because as you go into the cloud, you're going to start doing things on a bigger scale eventually over time. Right? So there's a compliance dashboard, and it provides you basically an aggregated view of everything that's going on in your environment, and an ability to check out and bring your resources into compliance through bulk remediation. So there's not going to be any of this individual onesie-twosie computer thing anymore. With that dashboard and with the power of Azure, you can actually have a compliance dashboard and make sure that all your stuff is in compliance. And if it's not, go back through tags and make sure who's got what. So common uses for Azure policy, basically implementing governance for resource consistency. And this is important, especially if you're a regulated industry. Right? So if you're in healthcare, or you're in energy, or you're in payment processing, or you're in any of those other things that either have a regulation, a law, or an industry standard, oh wow, this just makes your life easier. So that compliance dashboard and a policy dashboard really help you out. You can also then break things out by cost and management and security and all the other things. You can define policy for common use cases are already in Azure, and you can just use these built-ins to help you get started. And again, most times I see people they're starting out with PCI DSS, they're starting out with payment. And that's a great way of just getting everything aligned around that payment process, and then being able to track and manage that payment process as you go through. So all Azure data policy and objects are encrypted at rest, and that's important to know as well. So it's kind of protected data, and you don't need to know that for the test, but it's just good to know in general that because this data is considered sensitive, a lot of it's just simply encrypted at rest. So you are going to need to have explicit permissions through role to actually access this. So Azure policy evaluates resources in Azure by comparing the property of those resources to business rules. Now, these business rules are described in what's called JSON format, which is just basically a specialized, very relegated format known as policy definitions. You don't need to know what JSON actually looks like, but you just need to know that they are business rules, and they're in a very organized format called JavaScript Object Notation, JSON, right? And they're known as policy definitions. Several business rules can be grouped together to form a policy initiative, sometimes called a policy set. And once your business rules have been formed, a policy definition is assigned to the scope of the resources it supports. Now, you can break these things down by actual payment processor, or you can break these things down by here's all the things I need for Sarbanes-Oxley, or here's all the things I need for GDPR, or you can break things down to here's all the stuff that business needs to be responsible for, and then here's the stuff for legal. Again, your policy sets can be really kind of neat. You can break these things down by department or by function or by what regulation set they need to actually follow, but they all need to be business rules, and they all need to be really well defined. So going to the cloud requires a lot of really conformance to rules, which is great for due diligence. This will make your compliance, your audit, and your legal teams extraordinarily happy. It really will. But again, the assignment applies to all the resources within the resource manager scope. Right? Subscopes can be excluded. So if you have stuff that's on the production side of the house, you can actually exclude all of your dev test and QA environments from that, but you may want to have pre-prod environment where then you test all of the scopes, all of the policies, all of the security things and everything else before you get into production and find out that it doesn't work, because dev and test things were a little bit looser than they needed to be. All right, formatted documents, again, you just need to know that it's JSON format and formal logic of the evaluation. Again, JSON is actually really kind of neat. These definitions can include any metadata, any kind of notes, the reason why, what policy they belong to, and then the actual rule itself. The define rule can use functions, parameters, logical operators. So you can say must equal or greater than or less than conditions, property aliases, and you can also embed all your tags and everything else as part of the policy rule. The policy rule will determine which resources in the scope of the assignment get evaluated. Right? So evaluation outcomes, basically those resources are evaluated at specific times during the resource life cycle, right? The policy assignment life cycle and for regular ongoing compliance evaluation. The cool part about this is that all this stuff can be saved, or you can do a push button in case you get a surprise process. The following are times or events that can cause the resource to be evaluated. And those are when a resource is created, updated, or deleted. A policy or initiative is newly assigned to a scope. A policy or initiative is already assigned and is updated, or during the standard compliance evaluation cycle. And every 24 hours, it goes back and it will rerun this. And you get a really good idea on every day if your systems are still in compliance or within scope of where they need to be to make sure you're meeting all of your requirements for regulation, legal, or just industry standard. So you can control the response to an evaluation as well. So business rules for handling non-compliant resources can vary widely, and this is something you and your organization are really going to want to sit down and figure out on how do you want to handle someone spinning up a non-compliant resource. So you can deny that change and roll everything back. You can log the change to the resource and then go figure out what happened, right? And then figure out what you need to go back to. Alter the resource before the change or alter the resource after the change. You can actually go ahead and either make it so that, well, we'll bring it into compliance before or after the process happens. Or you can deploy related compliant resources along the way. You can actually force that compliance and make sure that it will go ahead and rejigger everything so it's compliant. So Azure policy makes each of these business responses possible and affects the full set of the policy rule. So again, the idea being is that you can actually either go in and enforce that policy one way or the other, whether you deny it, you just log it, or you alter the resource before and after, or you deploy only compliant resources. It's a way of making sure that you always stay within compliance and you've done your due diligence. So you can find and fix non-compliant resources along the way. Your first time you run this, or the first couple of times you run this, you'll find that there's a whole pile of non-compliant resources. So you really do want to go through and just identify them at first, and then go through and start managing how you want to update them, and what order, if they're critical or not. But you really will go through, especially the first time you run this. You'll be surprised at what you find on your network. Resources covered by Azure policy, it evaluates all Azure resources at or below the subscription level, right? So it includes all of your ARC-enabled resources. So if you have your Office, if you have your 365 Dynamics and other things, you'll get all the things you need to have. So certain resource providers, such as guest configuration, especially when you're working on Kubernetes or Key Vault, there's a deeper integration for managing setting and objects, but you'll still have stuff. It will just take a little bit longer for those to run, right? Recommendations for managing policies. Honestly, this is going to be a big thing for your company if you've never done this before. If you've never had this kind of picture before, it's actually going to be quite shocking. So you want to start with an audit. All right, just audit. Don't try to change anything. Don't try to deny anything. Don't try to write new policies. Just figure out where you're at right now. Generally, just that first initial audit, and then sit down with the impacted groups and go through and define those resources in the environment. Some of it may require tagging. Some of it may require major modifications to bring it into compliance. So you'll need to go ahead and set the precedence or order of operations for that. If you go and you set a deny effect, you may break things. So you don't ever want to just go in there and run an audit and then deny everything that's not in compliance. That will go break things, and you don't want to do that. That will just make people angry. So you do want to consider organizational hierarchies when creating definitions and assignments, right? So when you're going through your audit and you're going through the process, especially at first, try to get as many allies as you can. You can actually sit down and go creating those project definitions at higher levels, such as management, or you can set them at a subscription level. So let's say each department has its own subscription level, and only one department in the group is having problems, work with that one department. Then create the assignment, and then keep on working all the way down at each level as you go through until you get and create those definitions of a management group, and keep on scoping things down until you get everything nicely tidied and organized on paper, and then go through and make the changes, model those changes first, make sure nothing breaks, and then go ahead and apply it. So recommendations for managing policies, and this is kind of interesting. You should actually have a group of people that does nothing but manage corporate policies, especially if you're a big company. So they should be the ones that will manage these policies for your organization. If you're a smaller company and you're just doing PCI DSS or something simple like that, it can just be one person or two. You should always have at least two. But have something formal, have something in writing that these are people that manage the policies for the company. And once you've initiated that group or that people to do this work, just have them start doing things. Have them go through, run the audits, have them go through and create in the initial assignment, have them create the policy definitions if there aren't any already, or go back through and review those policy definitions. It's just really a great way of going through and making sure that you've got it as part of your new policy initiative, and make sure that you are evaluating each policy individual. All right, it really is. Each policy should be evaluated by their group. So there's some sample policy ideas, things that you can go take a look at. Are you monitoring unencrypted SQL databases in your security center? Do you have unencrypted SQL databases in your security center? If you have unencrypted databases, what's in them? Why are they unencrypted? Should they be encrypted? And again, it's that breakdown of policy. Monitor operating system vulnerabilities. Do you have effective patch management? If you don't have effective patch management, what will it take to get you into patch management? Will that be enforced by Azure because you're using software as a service or platform as a service, right? Or if it's not, will it be managed by the company if you're using infrastructure, and so on, and keep on doing endpoint protection or life cycle policy parameters, initiative parameters, and things like that. Go through and actually really take a look at what you've got cooking along the way. So in summary, policy is super important. It really is, especially part of your due diligence. It will make your compliance, audit, and legal teams happy. But Azure policy is a great way to manage all of your policy resources that need to be tracked across the board. Azure policy helps enforce the organizational standards and assess compliance at scale. That's really important. It also helps you bring your resources into compliance through bulk remediation. And that's the other thing on this one. So while there's a lot of things organizationally that need to happen to make sure this actually works, in Azure, it's really quite simple. You have a compliance dashboard, you have a policy set, you can enforce that policy set, and you can remediate that policy set along the way. And that's really what you need to know for the test, is just that: policy dashboard, policy set creation, enforcement, and remediation. And I will see you in the next lecture. Point 11, we are way past the halfway point for this lecture series, and we're going to talk about Azure Blueprints. So Azure Blueprints is actually really kind of neat. At the time, this was in preview, but it's showing up on the syllabus, so this is something you will probably need to know about. Again, when I took my test, I took it, and there's nothing on it. So, but you at least have a peripheral view into the service and kind of know what it's about. And basically what this is, it allows you to architect or sketch a project's design parameters. So the neat part about a blueprint is that it basically gives you the way to design or architect your entire cloud infrastructure for a particular process. So your entire architect and information technology team can sit down using blueprints and actually design a really cool system. And that's the great part. Once you've designed it in blueprints, you can just press a button and make it happen. It now makes it possible for the development team to build and stand up a new environment with trust, knowing that everyone's been able to sit down with their design and architecture team, and here's your blueprint, here's how everything works together. And if you give someone that big global viewpoint, they tend to actually understand what they're doing a whole lot better. They get their reason why. So blueprints are a great way of making that happen. So blueprints are a great way of just declaring how you're going to orchestrate the development of a system or a business logic problem. And you can do role assignments, policy assignments, resource manager templates, resource groups. You can get all the things in place in this one design document. It's really just kind of neat that then you also have something you can go back and take a look at and follow and track changes over time. So Azure Blueprint service is backed by the Cosmos DB. So Blueprint objects are replicated to multiple Azure regions. So again, that when you press the button to make your blueprint work, it's going to come from that NoSQL database Cosmos DB. Everything is stored in there. And again, that blueprint is your entire business logic and how it was put together. So it's backed in by that entire system, Cosmos, and push a button, it's replicated exactly where you need it to be. So it's different from ARM templates, and that's where this kind of gets confusing because the Azure resource management templates are really similar to blueprints. So the service is designed more to help with just your environment setup. So your blueprint is really more geared towards environment, where your ARM template is really more about the deployment. So your blueprint is really going to cover more of your resource groups, your policy, your role assignment. So it's going to be more of your administrative side, where your resource management deployment is really going to be more of what VM, what database, what blah, blah, blah. So you can kind of break it into the two chunks, right? Blueprint more for your policy and your objects, like that, resource, policies, roles, all of your administrative side, where your Azure resource management template, your ARM template, is more about what database, what server, what memcache, what database object store do I need? What kind of everything else do I need? So they actually really go together. So your blueprint bring each of these artifact types together and allows you to compose and version that package. So you can bring this in part of your CI/CD pipeline and actually have your developers building systems and then having your audit and admin and management teams working on what does the rest of it look like. And it's a really nice way of tying these two systems together. So I'm really kind of hoping that Blueprints kind of takes off because it really does give a nice CI/CD way to manage your permissions pipeline for who gets to do what with what part of the system, and takes that decision-making process to a whole new level of maturity, and one that you don't have to really worry your developers over, but it also gives them a way of CI/CD pipeline, gives them an understandable way of understanding those policy objects that they need to understand. So everything that you want to include in Azure Blueprints can be accomplished with an ARM template. And again, right, but Blueprint again is going to be more towards your policy level, and your ARM template is going to be more towards your operations and your systems level. The other thing that's interesting too is that ARM template doesn't really exist natively in Azure. It's stored locally or stored in a template file somewhere, where Azure Blueprints is stored as part of that Cosmos DB and replicated everywhere. So your ARM template can be used for deployments of one or more Azure resources, but once those resources deploy, there's no active connection or resource relationship to the template. So that's where Blueprints comes in. All right, it gives you that ability to control the template, and as you update the template, push those changes down. You don't need to rerun a template like you would with Azure Resource Management. So with Azure Blueprints, there's that relationship between the blueprint definition, what should be deployed, and then what was deployed is preserved. And you can actually version these things out, which is a great way of tracking how often change happens within your organization. Azure Blueprints can also upgrade several subscriptions at once that are governed by the same blueprint. So if you need to upgrade or something, you can actually do that through Blueprint. So when a blueprint is first created, it's considered to be in draft mode, all right? That's really important. When it's ready to be assigned, it needs to be published, and publishing requires defining a version. So you have versioning, and then with any kind of change notes that you want to have, who approved it, and that other part. The version differentiates it from future changes, same blueprint, because you're going to change things over time. Every company drifts all the time in terms of scope and what they need. Versioning also means different versions of the same blueprint can be assigned to the same subscription. So you can have a version 1, a version 2, a version 3, or version 1.1, 1.2. And have those in one subscription and have a different one for a different subscription. This is great for resellers or VARs, or if you're going to be redoing certain segments of your network to incorporate more of here's human resources stuff, will have a different blueprint than your legal side, which will have a different blueprint. Again, just another way of managing and controlling all of the resources along the way. So that published version is the one that will be done, but you may actually have unpublished changes in a new version. You may be working on a draft mode of a new version. So once those changes are complete and the updated blueprint is published, you'll get that new unique version, and version control is a big part of this. Blueprint assignment. Each published version of a blueprint can be assigned a max name of 90 characters to an existing management group or subscription. You can have blueprint for HR, blueprint for legal, blueprint for business unit 1, and so on. In the portal, the blueprint defaults to the version of the one that's published most recently, but if there are other things, then you can actually go ahead and bring up those earlier versions inside the portal as well. They never go away. So permissions to use your blueprints, you've got to be an administrator. To read or view a blueprint in Azure portal, your account must have read access to the scope where the blueprint definition is located. Again, this is a role-based RBAC kind of process. So you do want to make sure that if you're going to use it, that only the right people have permissions to it. So for a summary, this is something to know about on the test. It's on the syllabus. But the thing to remember about Blueprints is it's really more a native way of working with resource templates that are not available in Azure Resource Management, ARM templates. And it's a little bit more native. It works on Cosmos DB. It's really good for policy and policy set objects. So you may actually end up using both ARM templates and Blueprints together. But because it's on the syllabus, and my odds are believe, especially with it being in preview right now, is that you're going to end up seeing a lot more blueprints to not only just manage policy and compliance, but also the existing resource set of virtual machines, databases, networks, and everything else that goes along the way. So it's worth checking out and worth understanding about, knowing that it's on the test and it's on the syllabus. And that's it for this lecture. I will see you in the next one. 5.2, and we're going to be talking about the Cloud Adoption Framework. So the Cloud Adoption Framework is basically guidance designed to help you get started in the cloud. It's basically all of the best practices that you would ever want to know about how to create, implement, and manage technology strategies for the cloud. Every single different organization has some kind of adoption framework to help ease that path of transition. And Azure is no different, and they have their own specific best practices where organizations can better align their business and technical strategies to ensure that their cloud deployment is successful. There is probably nothing more horrible than having a failed project in an organization, and you really want to be very mature about how you go through and adopt the cloud. Not everything a company does is going to be perfect for the cloud, and you really need to go through and understand your business processes bit by bit. And then they've actually got videos, they've actually got the whole process of how to do this. Adoption process. So definitely go through, especially if you're new to this and you're learning just now how to adapt a project to the cloud. Definitely go through and watch all the learning materials that you can on this, because it's a real big thing. You really do want to follow the best practices. You're going to be spending money. You're going to be spending money that the organization maybe not have. You're going to be running your data center and your cloud in parallel with each other. So you're going to see an increase in all your operational expenses, and that's always going to cause some interesting discussions in the boardroom. So your cloud adoption framework brings together everything that Microsoft knows about best practices to ease this transition and make it easier for your company. There's basic tools, guidance, narratives, and these tools will help shape your technology, your business, and people's strategies, because people are a big part of this to make sure your business outcomes are successful as you go into the cloud. You really want to review the guidance, and you really want to understand this. Your program management office should understand this. Your C-suite should understand this, and everybody should really be on board when it comes down to how you want to process this. So the framework is just like anything else that you do. You've got specific plans, you've got specific steps that go into each one of those plans, and then you've got specific things that you want to tag off on. So this is going to be more for your project management office. This is going to be more for anyone that's trying to manage change management. This is going to be for people that are actually going to be sitting down on the IT side and going through, okay, what do we want to move? Why do we want to move it? And what are the expected benefits to moving? Right? So you're going to define the business justification and the expected outcomes of the adoption. And at this level, you're just working on the greater high-level strategy. What is it we want to have? Why do we want to have it? Why does this make this successful? What do we gain business-wise? What's our business reason for doing this? And then defining those expected outcomes. And then make sure those outcomes are trackable. Right? If we say we're going to save, 90% of CapEx, make sure you include how much OpEx you're going to be burning in additional to this, right? So make sure that you've got trackable things along the way. If you say you're going to increase your CapEx by 20%, make sure you can track that when you're setting up your dashboards. And if you're really burning 25 or 30 or 40 or 50%, okay, that's not meeting my strategy. We were supposed to save money by doing this, and then go back and figure out where are you not being effective, or was your basic idea of the justification of saving money really not realistic, right? We tend to be optimistic when we're working on strategy. We want everything to work out perfectly. Then you need to plan those actionable adoption plans to those business outcomes. If you're going to refactor your code, if you're going to do some business logic, whatever, make sure that everything is actionable. Make sure you've got specific steps that you can monitor, manage, and maintain all the way through your plan process. And then ready, prepare the cloud environment for the plan changes. And that means setting up your VMs, setting up your databases, setting up your Kubernetes, setting up all of your business logic, setting up your dashboards, setting up your cost controls, all of those things that you would need to do. Then test, migrate. Migrate and modernize your existing workloads. Make sure that you're going to run in parallel for a while, or if you're going to do a big just push the button cut over, depending on how you want to go about doing this. And then make sure that you're in the innovation. Make sure that you've got your code people and your administration people are doing cloud native or hybrid solutions. Especially if you've had to refactor code, make sure that your CI/CD pipeline is running at this time. Make sure that you're really paying attention to what's going on in the cloud environment, and as things pop up, because they will, that you've got people on board and ready at that moment to fix the things that are going wrong or breaking. And again, as you move customers into the environment, you'll find little things that you forgot or overlooked or weren't originally planned for. So be like super flexible when you get to that migrate and innovate section. And you really will want to have a dedicated team, people that are on board, ready to go all the time to fix the little things that are going to break along the way. You can't just move and then pull resources. You really need to have people on board for this one. Then govern, you need to push all your governance policies down, make sure that those environment and workloads are auditable, manageable, and maintainable from that vantage point. Make sure you can manage all your operations management, make sure that your crew is ready to go, that they understand how the dashboards work, that they understand how to push changes on global scale in the cloud. So you're going to have some retraining going on at this time as well, or you'll be hiring people specifically for the cloud for this process. And then organize, right? Make sure that your teams and roles supporting your cloud adoption efforts are actually really there. Make sure that there's some reward in there. Make sure there's some celebration in there as well, especially if you do well on your first initial launch and you've really well planned all this out. But this framework is great. This framework will cover a lot of the things that you may or may not see when you move over to the cloud. And you really do want to follow the framework. There's whole checklists and everything else on the Azure site, or indeed on any cloud provider site that has this similar framework to this whole thing. And just follow their checklist. Make sure your PMO office and your change management is ready to go. Make sure you have some C-level visible, really visible support for this kind of a project, because it's huge. This is almost a bet the company level project. So to understand the lifecycle that you're involved with right now, is each methodology is part of that cloud adoption lifecycle. Each step in there is basically a full framework in its own right that supports customers through each phase of the adoption, because you don't want to lose customers because you changed your business logic. The framework uses really common methodologies that we've already seen, right? And there's a bunch of blockers that can actually show up inside of your process, because everything changes. And this is the hard part, and because change is generally not something that people do or do well. We're not change junkies in a lot of ways. You'll have your early adopters that will absolutely adore this and will jump in, but you'll have a group of people at the tail end of this that will just never adopt. They'll always pine for the old ways, and you need to figure out how you're going to fix that and how you're going to manage that, right? Because the cloud fundamentally changes how enterprises find, use, and secure technology resources. It changes everything about the way you operate. Traditionally, enterprises have assumed ownership and responsibility for all aspects of technology, and it can be really hard to let go, right? You are used to that certain level of control, and you may legally need to have a certain amount of control over certain sections of your enterprise. You may actually literally need to control data or how data is used, especially if you're in power or you're in medical or you're in something else. So, you're going to have to figure out how to provision and consume resources as needed, when needed, and in what environment to meet your legal and regulatory obligations, right? And although the cloud is really super flexible, it's really easy to blow out your budget. It's really easy to build for peak instead of understanding current load. It's really easy to build for things that may not happen. It's really easy to just overrun a lot of things, because it is really super easy in the right hands to just spin up the resource that you need or you think you need and leave it always on. And you don't need to do that in the cloud, right? It's definitely not your data center at home. So the cloud adoption framework will help you guide those decisions throughout that cloud adoption and make sure that you are following the most flexible, most reasonable path that you can as you move into the cloud, because again, change is hard. So how to use, you really need to really be handy in your program management office, or your program manager really needs to understand the cloud adoption framework. It doesn't matter which one it is, whether it's Azure, Amazon, Google, or anyone else. That digital leadership, that digital style, being cloud native is really important. Your PMO, get them on board first and get your change manager in there early. All right, that everyone should be as enthusiastic and as excited about this, and you need to have senior level management absolutely pumped up. You need to be having a monthly board out reading for everyone to understand where this project is going. Your enterprise's digital transformation really involves the cloud and really does, again, changes everything. And a lot of the fundamental concepts that are a part of this change management plan will help you during this process. So for this test, you should know this plan. You should know each of these steps, and you should know what each of these steps does in a general way. You should be able to describe them. You don't need to know the in-depth steps for plan and ready and migrate. You should just know that there's this 7-step plan and that you really, or 8-step plan, and go through and do the things that you need to do with it, and just understand how it works and why it is so important to making sure that your move into the cloud is as successful as possible. And again, moving to the cloud is hard, so understanding how this plan works and can help you out will definitely help you out on the test. And that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in the next one. I went through privacy and compliance resources. So privacy has really become a huge thing since we've introduced GDPR, and compliance is part of that process. So Azure really does a lot of good when it comes to helping a company reach compliance. So again, 92 different compliance offerings, a lot of growth in this area, and mostly because compliance has become a real big issue. Right. I mean, you're talking to a person here who's had, his identity stolen, and most of us have had our identity stolen at some point. That all boils back to a compliance failing. Right. Azure's also added new services like blueprints that will help you create and deploy and update fully governed cloud environments to meet compliance requirements. This is all part of your due diligence. This is a huge part of being in the cloud, and this is a huge part of the reason why the cloud is actually really going to be super successful, is because it really makes compliance and governance and due diligence a lot easier. Plus, you get to rely on all of that expertise of the inbuilt larger corporation security groups that are going to be working to make sure that their environments are absolutely secure, and compliance is a big part of it. So privacy, right? There's been a huge explosion in interest on privacy. Facebook, big issues there. GDPR has come out, and that's actually become a global standard now for privacy. Even though the Americans have a different privacy set, most American companies do their best to follow GDPR because it is the most restrictive policy set that we've got, and it's pretty much become the global standard now for privacy. And it's really hard to do in a lot of ways. You can make your governance and compliance a lot more reliable and resilient. There's a whole lot of making sure that Azure is performing reliably and consistently across the board, especially if something goes wrong. So, and you also want to make sure that any kind of intellectual property that you've got is also protected inside of your code, inside of your data, and everything else. So understanding how IP and compliance actually works is probably going to be beyond a lot of people, but it's a certain subset of lawyers. So really having something like the Compliance Center will really help out and just make your life a lot easier. So compliance ownership, and this is the big thing you need to understand, is that customers are wholly responsible for ensuring their own compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. Information provided in Microsoft Online documentation does not constitute legal advice, and customers should consult their legal advisors for any questions regarding regulatory compliance. And that's also true for me, right? This is just a section, study notes, and compliance. This is not legal advice. This does not constitute legal advice, and really you need to talk to a competent lawyer. But the cool part about compliance ownership is that it really does fall to the company. It is each company's responsibility to be absolutely responsible for their own data and their own ability to be maintaining compliance with how that data needs to be saved and governed. And just make sure that you really do understand this for the test, and it's all on you. It really is. So now data can be located anywhere in the world. Right? This is the big thing. Sometimes data can just be simple as what's being processed at the time, and this is where this gets to be really kind of interesting, because there's a lot of international regulation on what data can cross what border and when, right? So if you're in China, data in Chinese nationals needs to be stored only in China, and that includes processing that data. If you're going to process data on Chinese individuals in the United States and ship it back, you can't. You really need to be having a wholly owned environment in China, and that's why China almost has its own sovereign region within the Azure data center process, because there are specific rules to operating in China that there aren't anywhere else in the world. So you can be either on Alibaba or you can be on any of the other systems. The rules are still the same regardless of where you are in China. So Azure services will enable you to specify which region your customer data will be located, and you really need to be aware of law on this one. You need to be aware of international law, you need to be aware of processing laws, you need to be aware of what's going on in the United States for law and all the rest of it. Generally Microsoft will not replicate your data outside of its chosen geography, but that also doesn't mean that it won't happen because of a failure. If there's a major outage in the United States, all of your stuff will move overseas. All right, it's just that simple. It depends on how they do things, or your systems will be down. depending on how you've set up your failover and your business continuity. Like recently we just had that outage with Amazon that took out Canvas, took out Netflix, took out a bunch of other things, and there was no failover. We couldn't move the data over, so those systems stayed down, and that was it. So as your environments, there's a lot of things that are available globally. And again, sometimes referred to, you'll hear things like commercial, public, or Azure Global. Azure China is available through a unique partnership between Microsoft and 20 ViaNet. And again, China is a unique environment. It's got its own rules. Azure Government is another thing that you won't get access to because it's all really part of the Department of Defense and it's reserved for the Department of Defense. It's really kind of neat. And you'll find these things called sovereign regions here. We'll talk about sovereign regions here in a little bit. But Azure environments are a big part of how they do things. Azure Government Top Secret is its own little super secret enclave that works with national security workloads, right? And then you need to meet your own compliance obligations for whatever industry you're in. Each industry has got its own regulatory and compliance environment, whether that's banking, healthcare, energy, or just whatever. You don't want to end up not being in compliance with whatever applicable rule, because that usually leads to a lawsuit. And this will help you get there in terms of understanding how compliance groupings work. So you can actually do 4 segments on this one: globally applicable, US government, industry specific, and then region county specific. So globally, things that you need to do, things like GDPR, US government specific, make sure you're in compliance with whatever, ballots for the Federal Elections Commission, or energy policy, or healthcare. Make sure if it's an FDA regulated device, you've got issues. And then anything that's industry specific, things like payment processing or high trust, right, as part of that. And then anything that's region county specific, you may have specific rules for whatever city you're in. The city of Seattle may have specific rules for how to govern certain city data for the city of Seattle, whereas the city of Bellevue has a different set of rules. You can change all that stuff around as part of your compliance process and make it work. So again, the compliance offerings are based on various types of assurances, including certifications, so you can get your SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3. You can get your high trust certification on your data center. That's all really easy to do. Just push a button, and they'll give you what they're responsible for. But remember, you're always responsible for your data. So they'll only certify themselves up through their layer, through the depending on what service you use. So anything past that is what you have to then go and attest to. And that can be kind of interesting, because now you've got to do an independent third-party audit of just whatever you are responsible for. You'll pull the audit for the Azure data center all the way through whatever layer you need to be responsible for. And then your auditor will come in and take a look at your code, or take a look at your data, or take a look at your compliance, take a look at all your controls, and technical and policy-wise. All that stuff still falls on you. It just saves you money in that you don't need to actually be trying to certify your own data center. So each offering description defines link to downloadable resources, and then you can manage out what your own compliance obligations are as part of this. And again, your legal team, your audit, and your compliance department are going to be a big part of this, because services and audit scope is a big thing. The cloud changes your audit scope a little bit. It's not really all that much, but you don't have to certify a data center. You don't have to certify links, connections, or a lot of other things at that physical level. What you just need to certify is how you've implemented your controls and your code. So Azure Compliance Certificate and audit reports really clearly state which online services are in scope and which ones are not, and which ones you are responsible for and which ones Azure is responsible for. So make sure you're really comfortable with that idea that compliance certificates and audit reports, are basically scope based, and you are still always going to be responsible for your stuff, your data, your crypto, your encryption policies, and any code that you may have written. So you will get certain documentation, right? You can get your audit documentation. You can access all of your reports through the Azure Government portal, right? Home Security Center, Regulatory and Compliance, audit reports. Your Azure Portal Audit Reports Blade is part of that process. And then Government Portal Audits Blade is also part of that process. So you've got your own audit reports and then your government reports, so you can have a subscription for either government or otherwise, depending on what you need to do. So if you're like Boeing and you have government work that you're doing, you can press button for government, or you can press a button for your own internal company. So a lot of availability. There's a lot of different kinds of reports and document versus the Service Trust Portal, right? And there's just a lot of stuff. So the Service Trust Portal has all of the audit reports for the things that Azure is responsible for. And they do break it down into different kinds of reports depending on what you need. Again, PCI DSS, ISO, SOC, FedRAMP, all that stuff. Then your data protection and the government and compliance, the FAQ, white papers, pen tests, and security assessments. You may still need to do some of that. And then you would have that as a separate compliance document. And again, you have to be logged in to check all this stuff. You can't just go check it out. You have to have an account. So other controls, right? Microsoft has an enduring commitment to data protection. Of course they do. And they will give you a bunch of stuff that you can comply with for other controls. And again, things like GDPR, Privacy Shield, EU model, HIPAA, high tech, high trust, you name it, it's all there for you. There's 92 different controls. So remember that number. Azure policy integration, again, your Azure resource manager, your blueprints, your Azure resource manager templates, you've got a lot of ways of making sure that your organization is able to enforce those policies across resources. And there's a number of ways of doing it. We've covered most of them already, and this is just kind of the roll up for compliance. So with Azure policy, you can define policies at an organizational level, at a group level, and then manage those resources to prevent developers from accidentally boo-booing. You definitely don't want developers or system administrators accidentally putting resources in place that violate the policies. And you can use Azure policy to just basically help with compliance scenarios, ensuring your data is encrypted or remains in a specific region to comply with GDPR. So again, there's that whole idea. You've got this automated system that can help people from making bad decisions or doing bad things independent of their organization. So again, your compliance manager, free workflow-based risk assessment tool. Your audit department should be running this on a regular basis, sharing that data with management and the security department. Your legal department should also be really, really super aware of this, because there's going to be an interpretation around Microsoft control and how the company is going to implement those specific controls. And again, it's all going to boil down to how do all these organization people follow with due diligence and make sure that everything in the company is protected the way it needs to. And then you've got some really cool stuff with information protection, which is more the file sharing, scanning on-premise servers to discover sensitive data. Make sure that you're labeling and classifying your data appropriately to help with data governance. So GDPR specific, and in the Azure Security Center, again, GDPR has really become the de facto privacy standard for the globe. And there's an entire process that goes along with this, including its own blueprint, right? And it can help you build and launch your cloud applications that meet GDPR requirements. So this is kind of a neat thing, is that as these compliance initiatives come forward, you'll either find an ARM template or you'll find a blueprint to actually help you get to where you need to go. Again, I'm kind of hoping that they bring Blueprint out of preview mode, which it is today, and try to bring it more into policy, because being able to automate your compliance outside of an ARM template really makes things a lot easier. So in summary, things that you need to understand is that there's a bunch of compliance tools that help make accreditation and audits easier. Your audit department, your legal department, and your IT department, including security, are going to be a big part of all of this. Microsoft at all times is not responsible for your data or how it is protected. That is wholly on you. Get competent legal advice. This file is not part of that. And then use the Compliance Center for support. There's a lot of neat things out there that can help you be compliant so that you can show due diligence in case something bad happens. And that's it for this lecture. I will see you in the next one, 5.14. We're going to talk a little bit about security, privacy, and compliance. I'm sure everyone is really getting tired of compliance at this point, but this is a huge section of the test. So I want you guys to all be really super ready for this. So one of the things that's really kind of interesting is, where did this data come from? This is probably the hardest section in terms of trying to find actual competent data on this inside the Microsoft site. So the core of this entire process for security, privacy, and compliance is coming from a PDF titled Trusted Cloud that basically teaches the underlying principles of security, privacy, compliance, and so on, as Microsoft understands it, given their history and track record. So this data comes from that document, and I'll give you the links to that down here at the bottom of this in terms of the summary. But it's a really, really, really generic kind of thing, right? There's called the Security Development Lifecycle, which is its own process in its own way within Azure. And Azure offers some really good tools to help detect and defend against threats. And we've talked about those throughout this entire process. So you just need to know about the Security Development Lifecycle, and that it's there to provide you with tools, the use of encryption, the use of security technologies, and at the network and infrastructure level, right? Then on privacy side, that you own and control your own data, that is repeated constantly throughout all this, and that you really should seek competent legal advice. Have someone that understands data and data security along the way, as well as controls around it. The Azure approach to privacy and data is grounded in its ability to give organizations complete control over the collection, use, and distribution of customer data, right? You may not get some of the things that you're looking for in terms of tools or in terms of control over tools, but there's a lot of ways of making things work in terms of compliance. So you may have to change some of your business processes to be more compliant with privacy, or you learn to use a different tool set, right? As long as you know that you understand you control all and own all of your own data, you're going to use the services that will help you do the things you need to do. But Microsoft will not mine your data for marketing or advertising purposes. They're very clear on that along through this documentation. You have control over where your data is located, who can access it, and on what terms. So you need to make sure that you're in compliance wherever you are with whatever data standard and data storage standards you've got. Almost every country now has some sort of only process data and store data inside of its nationalities, including places like Saudi Arabia, and its cloud security guidance really states if you're going to work with Saudi citizens, you have to store and control their data on Saudi sovereign territory, right? And that's everywhere. It's China, it's Russia, it's everywhere that you have these issues, right? If you discontinue the service, Microsoft is going to follow some real big standards for removing your data, and they will literally wipe it out. You cannot go back and recover your data if you forgot to bring it down after you've stopped service. So this big support documentation, Trusted Cloud Privacy and Trusted Cloud Compliance are really where you need to go to find out more about how security, privacy, and compliance work hand in hand with each other. But in general, what I've given you in this is enough for the test, but that PDF is well worth going through. It's about 37 pages. It's a really interesting read if you're into audit, compliance, and security standards. And but that's really about all you need to know, is that there are ways of doing things, and there's that whole security development lifecycle that you need to be aware of. And that's it for this section of the test. Again, really kind of small. And I will see you in the next lecture. Section 5.15 is the Microsoft privacy statement. So this has nothing to do with you. This is everything about how Microsoft is going to use your data or not use your data, or how Microsoft looks at privacy. And they pulled this out specifically so that you kind of understand how Microsoft processes data and for what purposes, and how they will take a look at the data that you provide Microsoft. So if you're doing an Office 365 subscription, your privacy statement's a little bit different than if you're just using function as a service within Microsoft. But the idea along the way is that your services agreement or the preview supplemental terms are different privacy measures, and that privacy measures differ over the kind of service you get, whether it's public preview, private preview, generally available services and products, your subscription information, because for some subscription information you really do need to have specific information, name, username, IP address, login information. You may store all of your personal files in the cloud or something else. It just all depends. When a customer tries, purchases, or uses enterprise developer products, again, so Microsoft's going to receive all this data from you and collect and generate data to provide that service. All right, and to conduct their own business operations and communicate with the customer. So not everything you do on the cloud is going to be independent of Microsoft. So in the Microsoft privacy statement, they specifically call out when data is collected. So again, whenever you engage with Microsoft, right, you're going to collect your name, collect some data about you and about your company, along with the customer's organization, and then things you need to have support. So you may have a bunch of trouble tickets and everything else. When the customer interacts with Microsoft support, when you pay for their products, you're going to have some payment information. You're going to collect all that payment info. When Microsoft is talking to the customer, we're going to use data to personalize the content. So instead of hi subscriber, it's going to be hi Dan, right? So they're going to do some customization of the content. And then when the customer engages with Microsoft for professional services, you're going to work with the contractors, consultants. They're going to learn a lot about your company and about your business, and to perform the services that you've requested as a customer. So the DPA, Data Protection Agreement, right? And that's another part of the privacy statement on top of it. When you subscribe to the service, you're going to have some data processing and security terms, part of the data protection addendum, right? So the addendum is part of your product terms, and you should know about these documents in general and how they're used, but you don't need to know exactly what's in those. That's for your legal department to know. But there are data protection agreements, and that Microsoft is going to do everything they can do reasonably and appropriately to protect your data. But if you do something weird and you expose your own data, it's not Microsoft's fault. So in summary, again, this is another short section, and you need to know what is inside of the privacy statement, the data protection agreement, and the operational terms. And it's basically a searchable database now. That's a huge pile of data, way too much data to cover in any kind of test unless you are really into compliance, really into audit, and that you know where to find the privacy, OST, and DPA statements, and you know what data is collected and for what purpose, right? And again, it's just really simple. The data that Microsoft needs to conduct business with you is part of this whole process, so that's going to be part of the privacy statement. You're going to interact with a company, and that company is going to use that data to help themselves and help you accomplish your goals. And that's it for this section. Again, another really, really short section. And I will see you in the next lecture. 1.6, nothing's complete without having some kind of place where you can go and find all the things that you need to find. And one of those is the Trust Center from Microsoft. So the Trust Center provides you basically an in-depth information about all of the things that Microsoft provides as a cloud product. So all the information about the security, privacy, compliance, policies, features, and practices. Right? It also gives you a bunch of additional resources for each topic, and there is a lot of data here. But the Trust Center is a really good one-stop shop to find about all the things that you need to find about. It will give you links to security, privacy, compliance, any kind of upcoming events, and all the rest of it. So basically, consider the Trust Center your one-stop shop for all the resources in your organization who need to play a role in security, privacy, and compliance. So again, it's a neat thing to have, and I'm glad that they have it. But the Microsoft will showcase Microsoft's principles for maintaining data integrity in the cloud. And while that's all good, you have, as an organization, your own culture and your own way of doing things. So in the Trust Center, you need to understand that it's Microsoft's principles for how Microsoft will implement and support security, privacy, and compliance and transparency in cloud products and services. It's an important part of the Trusted Cloud Initiative and provides resources for the legal and compliance community, right? And then from there, you need to take it and you need to run with it and bring it into your own environment and your own process for how you do compliance and management within your own company. So again, that Trust Center is your one-stop shop for everything that you would need to know about how Microsoft will protect your assets in the cloud. It's a web destination for compliance offering, law enforcement data requests, right? National security order reports, and international export controls. So yes, law enforcement can request data from a cloud provider just like they can request data from you with a proper warrant and all the other things. National security orders, same thing. They can pull up information as they need to, and they can do the same thing with you on your own premise. The only real big difference is that Microsoft cannot, obligated or otherwise, tell you that law enforcement asked about your company or that your company is underneath a national security order. So that's the big thing that you lose, is that if you are a thing and you are worried about it, you need to be in your own data center if you're doing something weird where a law enforcement or national security order may impact you. So something to think about. We're not going to impact everybody. In fact, it's not going to impact 99% of the companies in the world, right? So in-depth information about security, privacy, and compliance. Right? So your Trust Center is just that. It's your one-stop shop. Lots of additional resources for each topic. You may be super interested in law enforcement and national security orders, and this is the place you're going to go to find out about those. And you can get links to the security, privacy, and compliance blogs, any kind of upcoming events, and other neat things that you need to know about. So that Trust Center, super huge, super important to know about and know where to find it and know why it exists and know the things that are involved with it. And that's it for this lecture. Again, as we kind of wind down this section, these lectures kind of get smaller, and that's a good thing. And I will talk to you in the next lecture. Okay, we are into section 5.17. We're going to talk about Azure compliance documentation. So again, section 5 has really covered a lot of compliance and a lot of the tools and systems and standards that you use. And Azure compliance certificates and audit reports really are a different part of the process. So you really do want to understand the Azure compliance process for the things that Azure actually controls. And again, we've talked about this a little bit in the other sections, but this is specifically called out in the syllabus, and that you really understand where the limitations are in terms of scope for those independent third-party audits that you may need to do, and following which part of Azure is responsible for what inside that compliance statement. So the big thing about this is really just kind of understand that there's a whole lot of compliance offerings, and that for detailed insight, you really do need to go and pull out each of these audit reports for yourself, the ones that apply to you, and take a look at how they may actually go through and apply to your company. And again, that's way out of scope for the test, right? There's no actual audit and compliance in the cloud kind of test, but you really do want to understand how Azure Certificates sees your stuff, and then where that transfer of control and transfer of ownership actually happens. So Azure DevOps, very different certificates and audit reports. Dynamics 365 has its own audit reports, any kind of intelligent recommendations, and where is the process and legal responsibility around that. Microsoft 365 Defender, AppSource, Commerce, and Cloud Financial Services, all of these have their own demarcation points for who's responsible for what inside that Azure environment. And each one is so different that you really do want to make sure that you pull up the documentation and understand how that audit works. Your audit department is going to have a really good time learning a bunch of new things about how the cloud works and how ownership is transferred or kind of fuzzy around the edges around certain things. So you can always access the Azure audit reports and related documents through the Service Trust portal. Right? The Service Trust portal further breaks it into specific things that you may want to know about, like ISO, PCI, SOC, FedRAMP, GRC, and other subsections. So depending on which compliance documentation set you need to follow, you can actually break them down. And if you were always interested in going ISO but didn't know how to do it, you can actually go ahead and see where you fall into ISO and maybe actually already find that you're in compliance with 99% of it. So it's kind of neat that if you want a scenario plan, you can actually use the Service Trust portal as a way to scenario plan for other kinds of audits or other kinds of processes that may be of interest to the company. Right? SDP data protection resources divided into compliance, pen test, white papers, security assessment. We all have to go through certain things when it comes to security assessment, depending on what industry we're in. So you just need to make sure that you're in compliance with how pen tests can actually be done, or any other compliance guidelines that you need to follow. And again, you have to log in to actually get to these reports. These reports are actually kind of, some of them are under NDA kind of style. You can't talk about it on the internet kind of stuff. And that's important. It's all reasonable. You don't want to publish some data, and that's pretty normal. But the Service Trust Center portal is really more about getting you the governance data that you need to have. So you can get these reports under portal. We go home, Security Center, regulatory compliance, and audit reports. And again, the login is required. All the stuff is in the portal audit reports blade and in the government portal reports blade, depending on which environment you're in. You may be in government, you may be in that sovereign region for the government, and then you must have an existing subscription or free trial to go over and take a look at these audit documents. And they're fascinating. And there really should just be an entire thing about audit and compliance in the cloud. So in summary, though, this is where you find your compliance documents underneath the portal, underneath compliance, regulatory stuff. Right? Different audits have different online services and audit scopes, so you need to make sure you're following the right documentation set for what you need to work on to make sure you're in compliance for those specific tools and services that you're using within Azure. You should know where to find these underneath the Security Trust portal, and know that every service meets some or not all of the base requirements for most industry requirements you've got. You can use this to scenario plan, but you really probably going to have a few things that you need to filter in on your own. Nothing comes out of the box ready to go completely in terms of compliance, so there'll be some things that you need to do. Outside of that, though, that's it for this lecture. That's outside of what you need to know for compliance, and I will see you in the next lecture. This is the last lecture in Section 5, 5.18, Sovereign Regions. And we've kind of alluded to sovereign regions and some of the other sections, especially on compliance. So a sovereign region is basically a public cloud service that is not available for the general public. You have some really interesting places where you have government clouds or sovereign clouds exclusive by government bodies around the world. And as your government regions are basically invisible to anyone other than that government employee. So this writing, Microsoft retains separate regions, availability zones, and data center for the governments of the United States, China, and Germany. Again, China's just a really interesting use case. I've had to do a lot of work in China for the cloud, and it's really interesting the rule set you have to deal with there. It's no different than if you're working in the United States on GovCloud or on FedRAMP and trying to meet those responsibilities, and then Germany is about the same thing. It's actually going to be really surprising to not find that more and more governments are going to go in this route. They want to take advantage of the cloud. It's a great way of trying to save money and increase your IT capability at the same time, leveraging security and compliance resources in ways that you can't otherwise. So it's just kind of a neat process that they've got, and Azure calls them sovereign regions. So there are some limitations to this, of course, in that while all regions in Azure are actually just Azure region, sovereign regions are completely isolated from the rest of Azure, right? They're not necessarily fully manned or managed by Microsoft and may be restricted to certain types of customers. So again, a sovereign region is not part of the Azure network. They're just kind of using some licensing and branding. And like in China, right, it's actually owned and run by a subcontractor. It just is using the Azure brand and the Azure software and products, the Microsoft Azure products. So something to remember along the way. And then these regions are Azure China, Azure Germany. So they're actually turning off Azure Germany and being moved in favor of a non-sovereign Azure region, and then Azure US government. So that's kind of where we're at. It's, again, just enough to know that there's sovereign regions, and these regions are mostly going to be just China and US government at this point, as Germany kind of winds down their bit. So Azure government regions are inaccessible to non-government employees. At the time of writing, Microsoft maintained separate regions availability zones for the United States, China, and Germany. And again, Germany's getting ready to shut down their stuff as of this writing on this one. So the only two sovereign regions that should be left are going to be the United States and China. There's not a whole lot of this on the test, and there's not a whole lot of information to know about this unless you're actually working inside of those regions, you're working inside of GovCloud or following FedRAMP or China and working with VNet. So that's really about all you need to know for the test. And this is it for Section 5. This has been a super long section, and I want to thank you all for stopping and listening to this whole thing. Outside of that, though, we're going to move into Section 6, and then that's going to be cost management and how to manage costs, and then you guys can be ready for the test. Definitely take the practice test on this section because there's a lot of detail here, things you're going to want to know about. So thank you much. I will see you in the next section.